Sometimes the cruelest betrayal is not the affair. It is realizing you were never the name sleeping beside him in the dark. At 4:11 in the morning, Seraphina Ashbourne stopped pretending her marriage still had a heartbeat. The clock on the marble mantel ticked softly through the darkness of the master bedroom. Slow, elegant, merciless. Outside the tall windows of Blackthorne Manor, winter rain pressed against the glass in thin silver streams, while the wind dragged branches across the stone walls like fingernails. Inside, everything was warm. The fireplace still glowed faintly beneath its bed of dying embers. Thick velvet curtains trapped the heat. Silk sheets lay tangled around bodies that should have belonged to each other by now. They had been married for 3 years. 3 winters. 3 social seasons. 3 years of dinners eaten in careful silence beneath chandeliers worth more than most families earned in a lifetime. 3 years of watching her husband stand beside her in public with perfect aristocratic politeness while emotionally existing somewhere far away from her reach. Seraphina lay awake on her side of the bed, staring into the darkness above her canopy, listening to Theodore Ashbourne breathe beside her. Even asleep, he sounded controlled, restrained, the kind of man who carried discipline into unconsciousness. Duke Theodore Ashbourne frightened most people without effort. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Men twice his age straightened when he entered rooms. Servants moved faster when his footsteps echoed through hallways. Investors crossed oceans for a single meeting with him. Women watched him from behind jeweled fans during every London season, hoping for one glance that lasted longer than courtesy required. He rarely gave it. His reputation had been built on silence and precision. Iron railroads, shipping empires, coal territories stretching across 3 states. Newspapers called him the American Duke because old money families treated him like royalty despite the fact that no real titles existed anymore. But none of that mattered at 4:11 in the morning. At 4:11 in the morning, he sounded like every lonely man who had ever slept beside the wrong woman. Theodore shifted slightly beneath the blankets. His hand moved across the mattress between them, searching, not for her. Seraphina felt his fingers brush the silk near her waist before settling against empty fabric. Then he whispered softly into the darkness. "Vivian." Her entire body went still. Not dramatic stillness. Not shattered heartbreak. Something quieter, colder, like a lake freezing over in the middle of the night. For one suspended moment, she honestly thought she imagined it. The room remained silent except for the storm outside and the ticking clock beside the fireplace. Theodore breathed deeply again. Unaware, untroubled. Seraphina stared ahead without blinking. Vivian. Her sister's name. The name she had spent half her life standing beside like a shadow standing beside sunlight. Beautiful Vivian Veilcrest. Golden-haired. Brilliant. Effortlessly charming. The woman every ballroom remembered after she left it. Men used to compare them constantly when they were girls. Vivian was music. Seraphina was quiet. Vivian was champagne laughter and silk gloves and dazzling entrances. Seraphina was libraries and winter gardens and soft-spoken observations nobody noticed until later. Theodore whispered again, softer this time. "Do not go." The words entered her chest slowly, carefully, like knives designed by surgeons instead of soldiers. She did not cry. That surprised her a little. She had imagined this moment before. Not exactly this moment, but something close to it. Some terrible confirmation that would finally explain why her marriage always felt like standing outside a locked house in winter while pretending she was warm enough. She had imagined screaming, accusations, tears running down her face while Theodore apologized with shocked guilt. Instead, nothing inside her exploded. Something simply ended. Quietly, permanently. Theodore exhaled again. Vivian. Seraphina closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them and sat up carefully beneath the blankets. The room was enormous, nearly 30 feet wide with cathedral ceilings carved in dark walnut and heavy portraits lining the walls. Their wedding portrait hung above the fireplace. Theodore stood behind her in the painting with one gloved hand resting lightly against her waist. She remembered the artist instructing him to move closer. He never had. The distance in the portrait suddenly looked unbearable now. She pushed the blankets aside slowly and stepped onto the cold marble floor. Her bare feet flinched against the temperature. November storms always turned Blackthorne Manor into a beautiful stone tomb after midnight. She walked toward the fireplace first and stared at the wedding portrait in silence. Theodore looked handsome in it. Sharp jaw, dark formal coat, silver threaded cufflinks catching candlelight. Seraphina looked graceful too, calm, elegant, entirely unloved. The realization settled inside her with terrifying clarity. He had married her because Vivian left first. That truth had existed quietly beneath their marriage from the beginning, like poison dissolved into water. Everyone in New York society knew Theodore Ashbourne once wanted Vivian Vailcrest. The papers practically built romances around them during their engagement rumors years ago. Then Vivian disappeared to Europe with a married diplomat and left scandal behind her like perfume. 6 months later, Theodore proposed to Seraphina instead. At the time, everyone called it romantic. The quiet younger sister finally chosen. The forgotten girl finally seen. Looking back now, Seraphina wondered if she had simply accepted crumbs because she had been starving for affection her entire life. She reached toward the mantel and picked up the framed silver photograph resting beside the clock. Theodore and Seraphina at Newport 2 summers ago. Standing beside the ocean in white clothing while guests laughed behind them beneath striped tents. She remembered that day clearly. Theodore had spent nearly 40 minutes staring toward the arriving carriages before realizing Vivian never came. Seraphina placed the photograph back down very carefully. Then she crossed the room toward her dressing table. The mirror reflected a woman who looked strangely calm for someone watching her life collapse before sunrise. 27 years old. Pale silk nightgown. Dark blonde hair falling loose around her shoulders. Gray-blue eyes that suddenly looked older than yesterday. She reached toward her left hand slowly. Her wedding ring caught the candlelight. Platinum. Emerald-cut diamond. Cold against her skin. Theodore chose it himself. Or perhaps his secretary had. It no longer mattered. Seraphina twisted the ring once. She remembered the way her hands shook during their wedding ceremony in Manhattan Cathedral, while reporters crowded outside. Theodore barely touched her during their vows. At the time, she told herself he was nervous, reserved, respectful. Now she wondered if he had simply been imagining another woman in white. The ring slid free. She held it in her palm for several long seconds. Then she placed it carefully on the dressing table. The sound it made against the wood was almost nothing. Tiny click. Still, somehow it echoed through the room louder than thunder. Theodore did not wake up. Of course he did not. Seraphina stared at the ring one last time before turning away from it forever. She moved toward the wardrobe next. No hesitation now. No trembling hands. Something terrifying had happened inside her during the past 5 minutes. The grief was there. Immense. But underneath it sat something harder. Clarity. She opened the wardrobe doors quietly and reached for the dark navy traveling dress, hidden behind rows of expensive gowns Theodore's mother preferred. Lady Ashbourne loved dressing her daughter-in-law in pale colors that softened her into the background beside Theodore's sharp elegance. White, silver, dusty blue. Colors that whispered instead of spoke. Seraphina chose navy tonight because it belonged entirely to her. She dressed slowly in the dim light of the fireplace. Wool stockings, high-button boots, long coat trimmed with black satin at the collar. No maid assisted her. She preferred that. The fewer witnesses to the death of a marriage, the better. Behind her, Theodore slept peacefully beneath cashmere blankets worth thousands of dollars, while the woman he accidentally destroyed packed her life into silence. Strange. Seraphina expected rage. Instead, she only felt tired. Bone-deep tired. Tired of competing with a ghost that still breathed somewhere overseas. Tired of pretending not to notice how Theodore came alive whenever Vivian's letters arrived during holidays. Tired of dinners where he barely looked at her until she mentioned business matters because competence interested him more than intimacy ever had. Tired of being appreciated instead of loved. She crossed into her private sitting room adjoining the bedroom and opened the small leather suitcase stored beneath the chaise lounge. The case looked older than the rest of her belongings because it was. Her father bought it for her when she turned 18 and told her quietly, "Every woman should own at least one thing that allows her to leave." At the time she thought he meant travel. Now she understood better. She packed lightly: 2 dresses, gloves, undergarments, her mother's pearl hair comb, the account ledger she secretly maintained for Blackthorne Manor because Theodore trusted her organizational skills more than he realized. And finally, a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Theodore's letters during their engagement. She almost laughed while touching them. They sounded so formal now, so carefully polite. Not love letters. Business agreements wearing romantic clothing. Seraphina closed the suitcase gently. Then she froze. Footsteps echoed somewhere deep in the hallway outside. Slow, heavy, male. For one wild heartbeat she thought Theodore woke up already. But no. His breathing still drifted softly from the bedroom beyond the doorway. The footsteps passed eventually. Probably the night butler making his rounds through the eastern corridor. Blackthorne Manor never truly slept. The estate housed nearly 40 staff members even during winter months. Someone always moved through the halls like blood moving through veins. Seraphina stood motionless until silence returned. Then she carried the suitcase back into the bedroom. Theodore had rolled slightly onto his side now. Moonlight from the rain-covered windows touched part of his face. Even sleeping, he looked exhausted lately. The shadows beneath his eyes deepened these past months. Pressure from investors. Railroad negotiations in Chicago. Political tensions with shipping unions along the coast. He carried entire industries on his shoulders every day. And still, somehow, the thing finally breaking their marriage was not another woman in his bed. It was another woman living inside his heart. Theodore murmured something again in his sleep. Seraphina did not stay long enough to hear whether it was her sister's name once more. She walked to the fireplace instead, looked up at the wedding portrait hanging above it. Then she stepped onto the velvet chair beneath the mantel carefully and removed the painting from the wall. Heavy frame. Gold leaf edges, imported from Florence. She carried it across the room and laid it face down on the carpet. After a long moment, she opened the drawer of Theodore's desk and removed the silver letter opener resting inside. Sharp enough, precise enough. Seraphina knelt beside the portrait silently. Then she cut herself out of the painting. Not Theodore. Never Theodore. Just her own figure removed carefully from beside him until nothing remained except the Duke standing alone in expensive perfection beneath painted ballroom lights. She folded the canvas containing her likeness once, then twice, then placed it inside her suitcase. When she stood again, the room felt colder than before. Empty somehow, like the marriage already recognized what she was about to do. Seraphina carried the damaged portrait back above the fireplace and rehung it carefully. Theodore Ashbourne remained there alone beneath the gold frame, exactly as he had always been. She looked at him one final time. "You never noticed I was disappearing," she whispered softly toward the sleeping man behind her. "So I suppose you will not notice when I am gone." Theodore did not wake. The clock on the mantel ticked toward 4:43 a.m. Dawn remained nearly 2 hours away. Seraphina picked up her suitcase, walked toward the bedroom door, then stopped with her hand resting against the brass handle. One last look. Theodore slept peacefully beneath shadows and firelight while rain traced silver rivers down the windows behind him. For the first time since their wedding day, Seraphina realized she no longer belonged in that room. The knowledge hurt less than she expected. She opened the door quietly and stepped into the dark hallway beyond. Then she closed the door behind her without making a sound. By 5:18 in the morning, the rain had turned Blackthorne Manor into a world made entirely of shadows and silver reflections. Seraphina moved through the east corridor with one gloved hand wrapped around the handle of her suitcase, while the other held the collar of her dark wool coat closed against the draft slipping through the old stone walls. Every grandfather clock in the manor seemed louder before dawn. Tick, tick, tick. Time following her out of the life she had spent 3 years trying to deserve. The hallway lamps had already burned low for the night, leaving long stretches of darkness between pools of amber light. Portraits watched her pass from gilded frames. Generations of Ashbourne men with stern mouths and expensive eyes. Industrial kings pretending to be aristocrats. Theodore resembled them all and none of them at once. He carried their discipline, their silence. But there was something lonelier in him than the men hanging on those walls. Something colder. Seraphina used to think loneliness made people kinder. She knew better now. She reached the grand staircase and paused. The entrance hall below looked enormous in the early hour. Marble floors, black iron railings, crystal chandelier hanging dark and unlit above the foyer like frozen rain. During parties, this place glittered so brightly people forgot how empty it actually felt. Tonight it looked honest, vast, beautiful, loveless. She descended carefully, one hand gliding along the polished banister. The sound of her footsteps disappeared into the silence almost immediately. Halfway down the stairs, she noticed movement near the library entrance. A figure stepped from the shadows holding a brass candlestick. Mr. Holloway, Theodore's butler, 63 years old. Precise posture. Silver hair combed perfectly even at dawn. The man froze when he saw her standing on the staircase fully dressed with a suitcase in hand. His eyes widened slightly before professional composure buried the reaction. "Your Grace," he said quietly. Seraphina stopped 2 steps above him. "Mr. Holloway." He looked at the suitcase once, then immediately looked away. Good servants understood when not to witness things. "It is rather early for travel," he said carefully. Seraphina almost smiled at the effort behind his neutrality. "Yes," she answered softly. "I imagine it is." Rain rattled faintly against the high windows lining the entrance hall. Somewhere deeper inside the house, pipes groaned through the walls as the kitchen staff began waking furnaces for morning fires. Blackthorne Manor always stirred awake before sunrise like a massive sleeping animal. She had memorized every sound over the years. The servants beginning bread dough in the kitchen. Coal deliveries through the rear courtyard. Theodore's valet preparing hot water exactly 45 minutes before his employer woke. All of it moved with invisible precision because she made certain it did. Mr. Holloway shifted slightly beside the library doorway. "Shall I have Thomas prepare the carriage, Your Grace?" The words settled between them carefully. Not curiosity, not interference. An offer to preserve her dignity. Seraphina looked at him for a long moment. He had served Theodore's father before Theodore inherited the estate at 28. Men like Holloway survived generations by understanding grief without naming it aloud. "No," she said gently. "I have already arranged transportation." Another slight pause. "Does His Grace know?" There it was. Not gossip. Concern. Seraphina lowered her eyes briefly toward the marble floor. "Not yet." Mr. Holloway inhaled slowly through his nose. She could practically hear the calculations happening behind his composed expression. By breakfast, the Duchess would be missing. By noon, the entire household would understand something terrible had happened. By evening, New York society would smell scandal drifting through the upper circles like smoke. Still, he simply nodded once. "Very well, Your Grace." Seraphina descended the final steps and stopped beside him. "There is an envelope on my dressing table," she said quietly. "Please see that Theodore receives it personally." She did not say husband. Somehow the word no longer belonged to her. Holloway bowed his head slightly. "Of course." She hesitated before speaking again. "And Mr. Holloway?" "Yes, Your Grace." Her fingers tightened faintly around the handle of the suitcase. "Thank you for always pretending not to notice when I was unhappy." For the first time since she met him 3 years ago, the old butler looked genuinely saddened. Not shocked, saddened. "Some things," he said softly, "are only invisible to the person causing them." The words landed deeper than he probably intended. Seraphina swallowed carefully, then nodded once. "Goodbye, Mr. Holloway." "Goodbye, Your Grace." He did not ask her to stay. That hurt more than it should have. The front doors opened with a low groan against the storm outside. Cold November air swept instantly through the entrance hall carrying the scent of wet earth and distant pine. Seraphina stepped into the darkness before the footman could offer an umbrella. Rain touched her face immediately. Sharp, freezing, real. The black town car waited beyond the fountain at the edge of the circular driveway, headlights glowing through curtains of rain. Theodore's driver did not stand beside it tonight. Instead, a woman stepped out from the passenger side wearing a dark traveling coat and gloves. Eleanor Whitcomb, 32 years old, widow, owner of a small publishing house in Boston. One of the only women Seraphina trusted completely. Eleanor hurried toward her across the wet gravel. "Good Lord," she whispered once she reached the stairs. "You actually did it." Seraphina looked back once toward the towering silhouette of Blackthorne Manor. Hundreds of windows rose into the darkness above her like watchful eyes. Somewhere behind one of them Theodore still slept beside the absence he had not noticed yet. "Yes," Seraphina answered quietly. "I suppose I finally did." Eleanor studied her face carefully beneath the rain. Silence wrapped around them instantly except for rain striking the roof overhead. The driver glanced back briefly. "North Station, ma'am?" Seraphina looked through the rain-covered window toward Blackthorne Manor one last time. The estate loomed against the dark horizon like a castle built to imprison weather itself. 3 years ago she arrived there wearing ivory silk and believing quiet love might eventually become enough. Now she understood something terrifying. A woman could disappear inside a beautiful marriage long before she physically walked away from it. "Yes," she said softly, "that is not true." Eleanor remained silent. Good friends understood when pain needed room to breathe before becoming language. Finally Seraphina looked down at her folded hands resting in her lap. "He said her name." Eleanor frowned slightly. "Whose?" Seraphina swallowed once. "Vivian's." The car went silent except for the storm outside. Eleanor's expression changed slowly from confusion to horror. "Oh, just that." Because some betrayals were too intimate for dramatic reactions. Eleanor reached for her hand again. "Seraphina, do not," she whispered immediately. "Please." If anyone pitted her right now, she might finally break apart. Eleanor squeezed her fingers once before letting go. "Did he know?" Seraphina laughed quietly then. A soft broken sound swallowed by rain. "No," she said. "That is the worst part. Theodore Ashbourne did not even know he destroyed her." The car continued through winding roads lined with bare winter trees while dawn slowly threatened the horizon in pale shades of gray. Blackthorne Manor disappeared completely behind them after several miles. Seraphina kept staring anyway. Somewhere around mile 12 she realized she could finally breathe without forcing herself to do it. The realization frightened her more than anything else so far. Back at the manor, the clocks would begin chiming 6 o'clock soon. Kitchen staff would prepare breakfast trays. Theodore's valet would knock softly at the master bedroom door carrying coffee and newspapers. The house would continue functioning exactly as always for a few more minutes. Until someone noticed the empty side of the bed. Until someone saw the damaged wedding portrait above the fireplace. Until Theodore finally understood his wife had vanished before sunrise and taken something essential with her. Seraphina closed her eyes against the rain-streaked window while darkness slowly surrendered to morning. For the first time in years, she had no idea where her life would go next. And somewhere deep beneath the grief, the uncertainty felt almost beautiful. Theodore Ashbourne woke at exactly 6:32 in the morning to the sound of rain striking the bedroom windows and the strange feeling that something inside the room was wrong. Not loud wrong. Not dramatic. The kind of wrong a man notices before his mind fully wakes. A silence where another silence should have been. He opened his eyes slowly beneath gray morning light filtering through the curtains. The fire in the hearth had burned low during the night, leaving only faint orange embers beneath blackened wood. The room smelled like smoke, rain, and the ghost of Seraphina's perfume still lingering faintly against the sheets. Theodore lay still for a moment staring upward at the canopy overhead while sleep loosened its grip from his thoughts. Then instinctively he reached toward the other side of the bed. Cold fabric met his hand. Empty. His eyes shifted toward her side of the mattress. The blankets had been folded back neatly. Too neatly. Seraphina never left the bed carelessly. Even half asleep, She moved with quiet precision. Theodore frowned slightly and sat up against the headboard. Rain streaked silver against the tall windows. The clock on the mantel read 6:33. Strange. Seraphina was usually already awake by then, but she rarely left without at least speaking to him first. Even during difficult weeks. Even after arguments. Theodore rubbed one hand slowly across his face and glanced toward the adjoining sitting room. Empty. The connecting door remained partially open. No movement. No sound of pages turning beside the fireplace. No tea tray. The absence irritated him before it worried him. He pushed the blankets aside and stood, reaching automatically for the dark robe folded across the chair near the bed. His body still carried exhaustion from yesterday's meetings in Manhattan. Railroad negotiations had stretched nearly 11 hours, and 2 investors threatened to withdraw funding before Seraphina quietly resolved the situation during dinner with 3 calm observations Theodore himself had overlooked. He paused while fastening the robe around his waist. A strange thought drifted through him unexpectedly. He could not actually remember the last conversation he and Seraphina had that was not about business, schedules, or social obligations. The realization vanished almost immediately beneath routine. Theodore crossed toward the sitting room. Empty. Her favorite chair near the window remained untouched. A book rested upside down on the side table beside it. Essays on maritime trade routes. He almost smiled faintly at that. Most women in his social circles filled their mornings with fashion journals and charity committees. Seraphina read shipping forecasts for pleasure. He moved toward the dressing room next. Seraphina? His voice sounded rough from sleep. No answer. The dressing room lights remained dark. Then Theodore stopped walking. Something felt wrong again. Sharper this time. He looked toward the wardrobe. One side stood partially empty. Several dresses missing. Not many. Just enough to notice if you knew the room well. Theodore stared at the space for several seconds without understanding it. Then he noticed the jewelry tray near the mirror. Her wedding ring sat alone beneath the morning light. The world seemed to narrow quietly around that single object. Theodore walked toward it slowly. The platinum band reflected pale silver against the polished wood of the dressing table. For some reason his chest tightened unexpectedly. He picked it up carefully between his fingers. Cold metal. No note beneath it. No explanation. Just absence. Theodore frowned harder now. What the hell? The words barely left his mouth above a whisper. A knock sounded at the bedroom door. 3 measured taps. Holloway. Theodore set the ring down again immediately. Come in. The butler entered carrying the morning tray exactly as he had every day for years. Coffee. Financial papers. 2 letters awaiting signature. Holloway stopped after 2 steps inside the room. His eyes flickered once toward the dressing table, then lowered. Theodore noticed that instantly. Where is the Duchess? Holloway remained composed. Too composed. Her Grace departed the estate approximately 1 hour ago, sir. Theodore stared at him blankly. Departed? Yes, sir. For where? I was not informed. Something cold moved slowly through Theodore's stomach. What do you mean you were not informed? Holloway set the tray carefully onto the table near the fireplace before answering. Her Grace instructed me to deliver something to you personally once you awoke. Theodore watched as the butler removed a cream-colored envelope from inside his jacket pocket. Theodore recognized Seraphina's handwriting immediately. Elegant. Controlled. He took the envelope without speaking. His name sat written across the front in dark ink. Theodore. Not husband. Not Theodore Ashbourne. Just Theodore. Holloway stepped back respectfully. Would you prefer privacy, sir? Theodore barely heard him. He opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter inside. Only one sentence waited for him. I was never the woman you reached for in the dark. Theodore read it once. Then again. The room remained completely silent except for rain striking the windows. Holloway stood motionless several feet away while Theodore stared at the paper in his hand without blinking. Slowly, memory returned. Fragments from the night before. Exhaustion. Whiskey after dinner. falling asleep beside Seraphina while rain hammered the manor roof. And then something else. A dream, maybe. A name. Theodore's face changed almost imperceptibly. "No," he said quietly. Holloway remained still. Theodore looked back toward the empty side of the bed. Then toward the wedding ring resting alone on the dressing table. No, this time the word sounded sharper, more human. He read the sentence again. "I was never the woman you reached for in the dark." Understanding arrived slowly, horribly. Theodore closed his eyes briefly. Jesus Christ. Holloway lowered his gaze discreetly toward the floor. Theodore folded the letter once with rigid precision before setting it beside the untouched coffee tray. Then he turned toward the fireplace and froze completely. The portrait above the mantel no longer showed a married couple. Theodore stared upward in stunned silence. The gold frame still hung perfectly centered against the wall. But Seraphina was gone, cut cleanly from the canvas. Only Theodore remained standing beneath painted ballroom lights beside empty space where his wife used to be. The image looked grotesque now. Lonely. Like a man abandoned in the middle of his own life without realizing it yet. Theodore walked toward the fireplace slowly. Every instinct inside him suddenly felt unsettled. Wrong. He studied the damaged portrait from inches away. Precise cuts. Deliberate. No rage in them. That somehow made it worse. Anger he understood. Anger burned hot and obvious. This felt colder than anger. This felt final. Theodore stared at the empty space beside his painted figure for a long moment before speaking quietly. "How long?" Holloway hesitated. "Sir." Theodore did not turn around. "How long has she been unhappy?" The question settled heavily into the room. Holloway answered carefully because men like him survived by respecting dangerous emotional territory. "I believe," he said softly, "that Her Grace stopped expecting to be seen some time ago." Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. The words irritated him immediately because they sounded too close to accusation. "I treated her well." Holloway remained silent. Theodore turned sharply toward him. "Did I not?" The butler met his eyes briefly. Respectful. Calm. "You treated her kindly, sir." Something about that answer made Theodore angrier. "What is that supposed to mean?" Holloway chose his next words with obvious care. "Kindness is not always the same thing as love." Silence followed. Theodore looked away first. Rain continued sliding down the windows behind him, while morning light slowly filled the enormous bedroom with cold gray color. The room suddenly looked unfamiliar. He noticed strange details all at once. The flowers near the fireplace had been replaced yesterday. Seraphina always preferred white roses in winter. One of his cufflinks rested neatly folded beside today's tie because she laid out his clothing every evening personally despite having staff for it. His schedule book sat open on the desk with handwritten notes in her careful script reminding him about meetings he probably would have forgotten otherwise. Pieces of her existed everywhere inside the room, quietly maintaining his life while asking for almost nothing in return. Theodore felt something uncomfortable twist beneath his ribs. Guilt, maybe, or fear. He was not entirely certain yet. Holloway cleared his throat softly. "There is one additional matter, sir." Theodore looked at him distractedly. "What?" Mrs. Whitcomb arrived at the estate shortly before dawn. Theodore frowned. Eleanor Whitcomb, Seraphina's closest friend. A widow with political connections in Boston publishing circles. She planned this. Holloway remained diplomatic. "I cannot say, sir." Theodore looked back toward the empty side of the bed again. Planned. Packed. Left before sunrise while he slept beside her unaware that his marriage was ending. The thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. "Get me the station schedules," he said suddenly. Holloway blinked once. "Sir." "North Station. South Station. Every departing train within the last 2 hours." "Immediately, sir." Holloway turned toward the door without hesitation. Theodore stopped him before he exited. "And Holloway?" "Yes, sir." Theodore looked once more toward the damaged portrait above the fireplace. Toward the empty place where Seraphina used to stand beside him. "Did she cry?" The old butler paused carefully near the doorway. "No, sir." he answered quietly. That was perhaps the saddest part. Then he left Theodore alone inside the silence of the room. Theodore stood motionless for several long moments after the door closed. Rain battered the windows harder now while morning finally overtook the darkness outside. Somewhere downstairs the household began waking fully. Staff moving through corridors. Breakfast trays. Fires being lit. Blackthorne Manor continuing its routines exactly as always. Except nothing inside Theodore felt routine anymore. He looked down toward the letter still resting beside the untouched coffee. One sentence. That was all she left him. Not accusation. Not drama. Just truth sharp enough to cut through 3 years of denial in a single line. Theodore picked up the wedding ring from the dressing table again. The metal felt impossibly small resting in his palm. Suddenly he realized something terrifying. He could not remember the last time Seraphina smiled at him without forcing it first. The realization landed like a crack forming slowly through ice. And for the first time since his wife vanished before dawn, Theodore Ashbourne finally felt afraid. By 8:14 that morning, Blackthorne Manor no longer felt like a home. It felt like a machine beginning to fail one silent piece at a time. Theodore stood inside his private study staring at the stack of train schedules spread across the massive mahogany desk while cold coffee sat untouched beside his elbow. Rain still battered the estate windows. Gray light filled the room with the kind of color that made everything appear exhausted. Holloway waited near the doorway while Theodore scanned departure times with growing irritation. Boston, Providence, New Haven. 3 trains had departed northbound between 5 o'clock and 7 a.m. Any one of them could be carrying his wife farther away from him with every passing mile. Wife. The word sounded strange in his head now. Unstable somehow. Theodore rubbed one hand across his jaw slowly. He had already sent telegrams to 2 private rail offices asking for passenger manifests. He told himself he needed to know where Seraphina went for practical reasons. Safety, reputation, public scandal control. None of those explanations felt entirely honest. Sir. Theodore looked up sharply. Holloway remained calm as always. Mrs. Davenport has requested clarification regarding this evening's charity banquet. Theodore frowned faintly. What about it? Her Grace usually oversees the guest arrangements personally. Silence followed. Theodore blinked once. Of course she did. The realization irritated him again because he suddenly noticed how many invisible responsibilities carried Seraphina's fingerprints. Charity dinners, guest lists, estate correspondence, staff rotations, vendor negotiations. She managed all of it quietly enough that he rarely thought about the work existing at all. Tell Mrs. Davenport to proceed as scheduled, Theodore answered shortly. Holloway hesitated. Sir, there is no finalized seating chart. Theodore stared at him. Then have someone make one. Her Grace normally handled diplomatic placements herself due to the conflict between the Harrington and Lowell families. Theodore's patience thinned immediately. Good God! Holloway wisely said nothing. Theodore exhaled sharply and pushed back from the desk. Fine. I will review it myself. Another pause. Anything else? 3 kitchen suppliers are awaiting authorization signatures. The West Conservatory heating system failed overnight. Mr. Collins requires approval for the winter staff contracts. And the New York Opera Committee called twice regarding your attendance tomorrow evening. Theodore looked at him with growing disbelief. Why are these matters suddenly reaching me directly? Holloway's expression remained carefully neutral. Because Her Grace usually resolved them before they reached your desk, sir. The room went very still after that. Theodore leaned back slowly in his chair. Somewhere deep beneath irritation, another emotion shifted uncomfortably through him. Shame, perhaps. He glanced toward the stack of unsigned documents beside the desk blotter. Seraphina's handwriting covered several margins with small organized notes. Heating estimates, vendor concerns, staff recommendations. Entire systems he barely noticed had apparently depended on her constant attention. He suddenly remembered a dinner party 6 months earlier where a senator complimented Theodore on how flawlessly Blackthorne Manor operated compared to other estates. Theodore accepted the praise without thinking. Seraphina smiled quietly beside him and changed the subject before anyone noticed she deserved the credit instead. The memory landed harder than expected. "Sir." Theodore looked back toward Holloway. The hallway outside buzzed faintly with staff movement now that the estate fully awakened for the day. Somewhere downstairs Crystal rattled softly as breakfast service began. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. Yet the entire manor felt subtly off balance without Seraphina moving quietly through it. Theodore noticed dust on one of the stair railings for the first time in years. A flower arrangement near the corridor window sat unevenly tilted. Small imperfections. Tiny failures. Still, he noticed them now. The blue drawing room overlooked the southern gardens through towering windows washed silver by rain. Vivian stood near the fireplace wearing a fitted ivory coat trimmed with fox fur at the collar. Golden hair pinned elegantly beneath a cream-colored hat. She looked exactly like memory always remembered her. Beautiful in the polished, expensive way certain women spent entire lives perfecting. She turned immediately when Theodore entered. "Theodore." Her voice carried warmth wrapped carefully around concern. "I came as soon as I heard." Theodore stopped several feet away from her. "Heard what?" Vivian's expression softened delicately. "That Seraphina left." There it was again. Left. As though his wife simply stepped outside briefly instead of vanishing from his life before sunrise. Theodore walked past her toward the fireplace without answering immediately. Vivian watched him carefully the way intelligent women study dangerous weather. "No one knows where she went?" she asked. "Not yet." "Did you argue?" Theodore poured himself coffee from the silver service tray resting nearby. "Black. Bitter. Necessary." "No." Vivian frowned slightly. "Then why would she suddenly disappear?" Theodore stared into the dark surface of the coffee cup without answering. "Because I whispered your name while sleeping beside my wife." The thought moved through him like broken glass. Vivian stepped closer slowly. "Theodore." He finally looked at her. She really did resemble Seraphina around the eyes. Same gray-blue color. Same sharp intelligence hidden beneath aristocratic calm. But where Seraphina always softened rooms quietly, Vivian controlled them. Everything about her demanded attention. Theodore used to admire that once. Now it exhausted him unexpectedly. "What happened?" she asked again. Theodore considered lying. It would have been easier. Cleaner. But exhaustion stripped something from him this morning. "I said your name." Vivian blinked once. "What?" Theodore looked away toward the rain-covered gardens beyond the windows. While sleeping apparently. Silence flooded the room. Vivian stared at him in stunned disbelief for several seconds before quietly setting down her gloves on the nearby table. "Oh." Same reaction Eleanor had. Not outrage. Not drama. Just the awful understanding of intimate damage too painful for theatrics. Theodore drank the coffee finally. Cold already. She heard it. Vivian crossed her arms slowly against the ivory coat. "And left." "Yes." Rain struck the windows harder. Somewhere upstairs a clock chimed 8:15. Theodore suddenly felt tired beyond language. Vivian studied him carefully now with something new behind her expression. Not flirtation. Not nostalgia. Guilt, perhaps. "Theodore," she said quietly, "you cannot honestly be surprised." His head turned sharply toward her. "Excuse me?" Vivian sighed softly and moved toward the fireplace. "I am not defending her leaving without explanation. But Seraphina has been unhappy for years." Theodore's jaw tightened immediately. "Everyone seems eager to inform me of that today." Vivian met his eyes directly. "Because you never noticed." The words landed harder coming from her somehow. Theodore set the coffee cup down with controlled precision. "I treated her with respect." Vivian almost smiled sadly. "You treated her like someone valuable to your household. Not your heart." Theodore's temper flickered now. "And what exactly does that mean?" Vivian tilted her head slightly while studying him. "Do you remember her birthday last year?" Theodore frowned. "Of course I do. What did you give her?" Theodore opened his mouth immediately, then stopped. Silence stretched. Vivian watched realization begin forming behind his eyes. Not because he forgot entirely. Worse, because someone else probably handled it for him. The emerald bracelet, Theodore answered finally. Vivian's expression remained gentle. Your secretary selected it. Theodore looked away instantly. That does not mean anything. No. Vivian walked slowly toward the rain-streaked windows. Seraphina once spent 6 weeks learning railroad terminology because she wanted to understand your work better during the Chicago negotiations. Theodore stared at her. What? Vivian laughed quietly without humor. You never noticed that either? Theodore said nothing, because he had not. Vivian continued softly while watching rain slide down the glass. She asked me once what kind of books you preferred during difficult business periods. Apparently your moods changed depending on whether you were reading economic history or political biographies. Theodore felt something uncomfortable move sharply through his chest. Why are you telling me this? Vivian finally turned back toward him fully. Because my sister loved you so much she rebuilt entire parts of herself just to stand beside you without becoming a burden. Silence swallowed the room whole after that. Theodore suddenly remembered dozens of tiny moments all at once. Seraphina quietly bringing him coffee during late financial meetings without being asked. Her ability to predict which investors would become problems before negotiations even began. The way she always remembered exactly how he preferred correspondence organized during stressful weeks. Invisible acts. Constant acts. Love hidden inside competence because perhaps she stopped believing affection alone would ever reach him. Theodore looked down toward his hands slowly. Jesus. Vivian watched him carefully for a long moment. Do you know what the saddest part is? She asked quietly. Theodore did not answer. Vivian's voice softened further. She never blamed you. Not once. That hurt worst of all. If Seraphina screamed or accused or hated him, Theodore could have defended himself somehow. But quiet disappointment left nothing to fight against except his own reflection. Holloway appeared in the doorway moments later. Sir. Theodore looked up sharply. What now? The rail office responded. Theodore straightened immediately. And Holloway stepped forward holding a telegram. Mrs. Whitcomb and another female passenger boarded the 5:40 northbound private line to Boston this morning. Theodore took the telegram instantly. Boston. Nearly 200 miles away already. He stared at the paper for several long seconds before folding it once with rigid control. Vivian watched him closely. What are you going to do? Theodore looked toward the rain-dark windows again. Toward the storm swallowing the horizon beyond Blackthorne Manor. Then toward the empty space inside himself growing larger every hour Seraphina remained gone. I do not know yet, he admitted quietly. And for the first time in his adult life, Theodore Ashbourne truly hated the sound of uncertainty in his own voice. The storm finally broke sometime after noon, but Blackthorne Manor remained cold long after the rain stopped. Theodore stood alone in the West Conservatory with one hand resting against the glass wall overlooking the winter gardens while pale sunlight struggled through layers of heavy cloud above the estate grounds. The conservatory had always been Seraphina's favorite place inside the manor. He realized that only because she was gone. White orchids lined the eastern shelves beside climbing ivy she personally maintained despite employing 3 full-time gardeners. A chessboard sat untouched near the fountain in the center of the room. One of her books rested upside down beside it with a dried lavender stem marking the page. Evidence everywhere. Quiet evidence. Theodore hated how much of her suddenly existed inside his vision now that she no longer occupied the house itself. You are wearing yourself thin already. Vivian's voice drifted softly through the conservatory doorway behind him. Theodore did not turn immediately. I am perfectly fine. No, her heels clicked slowly against the marble floor as she approached. You are trying very hard to appear fine. Theodore exhaled sharply through his nose. Do not start psychoanalyzing me this afternoon, Vivian. She stopped beside him near the glass wall and folded her arms lightly across the cream-colored dress she changed into earlier. Elegant as always. Composed. Yet Theodore noticed something unfamiliar beneath her usual confidence today. Unease. I am not analyzing you, she said quietly. I am recognizing you. Theodore finally looked at her. Meaning? Vivian studied his face carefully for several seconds before answering. You only become this controlled when something truly matters to you. Theodore looked away immediately toward the winter roses outside. Dead branches tangled beneath weak November sunlight. You are mistaken. Am I? Silence settled between them. Theodore hated how exhausting every conversation suddenly felt. Holloway had informed him nearly an hour earlier that Seraphina arrived safely in Boston based on a second telegram from Eleanor Whitcomb's private residence. Safe. The word should have relieved him. Instead it left him restless in ways he could not explain. Safe meant farther away. Safe meant settled enough not to come back quickly. Theodore rubbed one hand across the back of his neck slowly. I should have noticed, he admitted finally. Vivian's expression softened faintly. Yes. No denial. No comforting lie. Just honesty. Theodore almost appreciated that. She looked at me differently these past months, he continued quietly. I noticed it. I simply never asked why. Vivian moved toward the small fountain nearby while listening. Water trickled softly through marble tiers beneath the glass ceiling overhead. Seraphina stopped hoping you would choose her emotionally a long time ago, she said carefully. After that, she focused on becoming useful instead. Theodore's jaw tightened again. Useful. The word sounded ugly now. Transactional. I never asked that of her. No, Vivian agreed gently, which almost makes it worse. Theodore stared toward the orchids lining the shelves. White petals. Perfectly maintained. Seraphina once explained to him that orchids only bloomed properly when conditions remained stable enough for trust. At the time he barely listened. Now memory replayed the moment with painful clarity. Did she ever talk to you about leaving? Theodore asked quietly. Vivian hesitated before answering. Not directly. Theodore turned toward her sharply. Meaning indirectly? Vivian sighed softly. 3 months ago she asked me whether I believed marriages could survive emotional loneliness indefinitely. Theodore felt the words like impact against his chest. And what did you tell her? Vivian looked down briefly toward the fountain water. I told her some women survive by shrinking themselves smaller every year until there is almost nothing left. Theodore stared at her without speaking, because suddenly he could see it. The slow disappearing. Tiny pieces of Seraphina fading quietly over time while he remained too distracted or too selfish to notice. She used to play piano in the evenings after dinner. He could not remember hearing music in the manor for months now. She used to argue with him about politics during carriage rides through the city. At some point she simply started agreeing instead. Theodore once admired how calm his marriage felt compared to the dramatic social disasters surrounding other wealthy couples. Now he wondered if silence was not peace at all. Maybe silence was surrender. Vivian moved closer slowly. Theodore. He looked at her again. You loved the version of me you created in your head years ago, she said softly. The idea. The challenge. The woman who always stayed slightly out of reach. Theodore frowned faintly. That is not true. Vivian gave him a sad smile. It is completely true. The conservatory grew quiet except for the fountain water and distant wind brushing against the glass overhead. Do you know why I never married you? She asked suddenly. Theodore blinked once. I assumed you lost interest. Vivian laughed softly without humor. No. I realized very early that you did not actually see women. You saw roles. Theodore's expression hardened slightly. That is unfair. Is it? Vivian stepped toward the orchids and lightly touched one pale bloom with gloved fingertips. You admired me because I fascinated rooms. You married Seraphina because she stabilized them. Theodore said nothing, because part of him feared she might be right. Vivian continued quietly. But the thing you never understood is that my sister loved you in ways I never could. Theodore looked down toward the marble floor. Then why did she never say anything? She did. Theodore frowned. No, she did not. Vivian's eyes lifted toward him slowly. Theodore, my sister practically built her life around you. The words landed brutally because they were true. Seraphina memorized his schedules, learned investor names, studied market reports so she could follow his conversations during dinner, rearranged entire social calendars whenever he looked exhausted after difficult negotiations. She paid attention constantly while asking for almost nothing in return except perhaps the impossible thing he never realized she needed most: to be reached for first. Theodore sat slowly on the stone bench near the fountain and leaned forward with his forearms resting against his knees. For the first time since dawn, he looked genuinely tired instead of merely controlled. "I did care about her." Vivian nodded once. "I know. I still do." Another pause. "I think." Vivian watched him carefully. "And that uncertainty is exactly why she left." Theodore closed his eyes briefly. God. Every conversation today peeled another layer away from the comfortable version of himself he spent years believing. Powerful men rarely examined their own emotional failures because the world usually rewarded them regardless. Theodore suddenly wondered how many times Seraphina stood beside him feeling invisible, while entire rooms praised him for qualities she quietly maintained behind the scenes. The thought made him feel sick. "What happens now?" he asked eventually. Vivian remained silent for several moments before answering honestly. "That depends on whether you miss your wife or simply miss what she did for your life." Theodore opened his eyes slowly at that. The question settled into him deeper than anything else she said all morning. Because he did miss the practical things already. The organized schedules. The calmness she brought into chaotic rooms. The way she softened the sharp edges of Blackthorne Manor until the estate almost resembled warmth. But beneath those losses something else existed too. Something far less manageable. He missed her voice. Quiet and intelligent beside him during sleepless nights. He missed the way she tucked loose hair behind one ear while reading near the fireplace. He missed the feeling of entering crowded ballrooms and somehow locating her immediately even when he barely acknowledged doing it. Theodore stared ahead toward the fountain water rippling softly beneath pale winter light. "I do not know how to fix this." Vivian's expression shifted unexpectedly then. Less guarded. Almost compassionate. "Maybe you cannot." Theodore looked up sharply. "What is that supposed to mean?" Vivian folded her gloves carefully in her hands. "You broke something inside her slowly, Theodore. Quietly. Those wounds do not heal because a man suddenly feels guilty." The words hit hard because no anger existed behind them. Just truth. Theodore stood abruptly and walked toward the conservatory windows again. Beyond the glass, the estate grounds stretched cold and empty beneath fading storm clouds. Somewhere nearly 200 miles north, Seraphina sat inside Eleanor Whitcomb's Boston townhouse, probably believing she finally escaped a marriage that hollowed her out year after year. Theodore pressed one hand against the cold glass slowly. "I never meant to hurt her." Vivian's voice softened behind him. "Intentions do not comfort lonely people." Silence returned once more. Long, heavy. Theodore watched a groundskeeper move through the far gardens, gathering broken branches left behind by the storm, cleaning damage after weather passed through. The image unsettled him unexpectedly. "She cut herself out of the portrait," he said quietly after several minutes. Vivian looked toward him carefully. "What?" Theodore stared through the glass while speaking. "The wedding portrait above the fireplace. She removed herself from it before leaving." Vivian inhaled softly. "Oh, Seraphina." Theodore closed his eyes briefly again. "I do not think she plans to come back." No one answered him immediately because the truth hung too heavily inside the conservatory already. Finally Vivian stepped closer until she stood beside him near the window. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "you should stop asking whether she still loves you and start asking whether you ever truly deserved it." Theodore looked down toward the winter gardens beyond the glass, while something unfamiliar and frightening settled slowly into his chest. Regret. Real regret. Not the shallow discomfort of inconvenience. Not wounded pride. This felt deeper, colder. The terrible realization that the woman who loved him most in the world might have finally stopped hoping he would ever love her back correctly. And for the first time in years, Theodore Ashbourne understood exactly how empty power felt when the one person who made a house resemble home no longer lived inside it. Boston smelled different from New York in November. Less polished. Less theatrical. The air carried salt from the harbor and cold iron from the train lines cutting through the city like scars beneath gray skies. Seraphina stood beside the tall windows of Eleanor Whitcomb's townhouse, watching late afternoon fog drift slowly between brick buildings, while carriage wheels hissed across wet streets below. The city moved with quieter rhythm than Manhattan. Fewer headlines, fewer performances, fewer people pretending wealth automatically made them happy. She liked it immediately. Eleanor's townhouse sat along Beacon Hill on a narrow street lined with old gas lamps and black iron railings still slick from yesterday's storm. Warm amber light filled the drawing room around her. Fire crackling softly. Books stacked in uneven towers beside velvet chairs. Tea growing cold on the table because Seraphina forgot to drink it again. Everything about the house felt lived in instead of displayed. Eleanor entered carrying a folded newspaper beneath one arm and stopped when she noticed Seraphina still standing by the window in silence. "You have been staring outside for nearly 20 minutes. Seraphina blinked slightly as though waking from somewhere distant. "Have I?" Eleanor crossed the room and handed her the newspaper carefully. "You made the front page of the society column." Seraphina looked down reluctantly. The headlines sat near the bottom corner beneath political reports and stock market updates. Mysterious departure from Blackthorne Manor. The article itself remained vague. Wealthy people protected scandals carefully, but speculation already leaked through every sentence. Rumors of marital difficulties, sudden travel, the absence of Duchess Ashbourne from 3 upcoming charity events. Seraphina folded the newspaper closed again almost immediately. "That was fast." Eleanor gave a dry laugh. The rich smell emotional disaster before breakfast. Seraphina placed the paper on the table beside the untouched tea. Her fingers lingered briefly against the edge of it. Theodore would have seen the article hours ago by now. The thought moved through her chest with dull ache instead of sharp pain. That surprised her. Everything hurt less once distance entered the wound. Not gone, just quieter. Eleanor watched her carefully from across the room. "Do you regret it yet?" Seraphina turned back toward the windows overlooking the fog-covered street. "Leaving?" "Yes." A long pause followed. Seraphina listened to carriage wheels below. Wind rattling faintly against the windows. Somewhere nearby church bells rang for slow notes through the city. "No," she answered honestly. "I regret waiting this long." Eleanor nodded once as though she expected exactly that answer. Then she moved toward the fireplace and poured fresh tea into 2 cups. "Good," she said quietly, "because I do not intend to let you crawl back there simply because loneliness becomes inconvenient." Seraphina almost smiled faintly at that. Eleanor had always loved her fiercely enough to sound harsh while protecting her. "I am not going back." The certainty in her own voice startled her slightly. Eleanor handed her a fresh cup carefully. "Then what are you going to do?" Seraphina wrapped both hands around the warm porcelain while considering the question seriously for the first time. What now? Strange how women were expected to build entire identities around marriage while men still remained themselves afterward. Theodore would continue being Theodore Ashbourne regardless of whether she existed beside him publicly. Powerful, respected, important. But Seraphina no longer knew who she was outside the role of wife she spent years performing quietly. The realization frightened her more than leaving itself. "I do not know yet," she admitted softly. Eleanor settled into the chair near the fire with one leg crossed elegantly over the other. "Well, that makes 2 of us." Seraphina looked toward her. Eleanor smiled faintly into her teacup. "I know exactly how terrifying freedom feels after spending years surviving inside someone else's expectations." The words lingered between them gently. Eleanor understood better than most. Her own husband died 5 years earlier after a marriage built almost entirely around public appearances and private loneliness. Widowhood saved her in ways grief never entirely erased. Seraphina moved slowly toward the fireplace and lowered herself onto the velvet sofa opposite Eleanor. Warmth from the fire soaked gradually through the cold still trapped beneath her skin from traveling. She had barely slept since leaving Blackthorne Manor before dawn. Every time exhaustion pulled her toward unconsciousness, she remembered Theodore's voice in the darkness, whispering another woman's name with tenderness, he never gave her awake. Eleanor studied her quietly over the rim of her teacup. You still love him? Not a question. Seraphina stared into the flames. Unfortunately, that complicates things. Yes. Silence settled comfortably afterward. Unlike the silences inside Blackthorne Manor, these did not feel heavy with unspoken disappointment. They simply existed. Human. Safe. Eventually Eleanor set her cup aside. There is something else. Seraphina looked up. Eleanor hesitated briefly before continuing. Theodore telegraphed this afternoon. Seraphina's entire body stiffened instantly despite herself. What? Eleanor reached toward the small side table and picked up a folded telegram resting there. It arrived an hour ago. Seraphina stared at it without moving. Theodore's name alone tightened something painfully inside her chest. Eleanor held the telegram out carefully. I did not open it. Seraphina accepted the folded paper slowly. Her fingers trembled once before stilling again. Strange how a few words from one person could still hold so much emotional power even after they broke your heart. She unfolded the telegram carefully. Seraphina, please tell me where you are staying. I only want to know you are safe. Theodore. That was all. No demands. No anger. No explanations. Somehow the restraint hurt worse. Seraphina read the message twice before folding it closed again. Eleanor watched her face closely. What are you thinking? Seraphina looked down at the telegram in her hands. I think this is the first time in 3 years he has ever admitted wanting something emotionally from me. Eleanor leaned back slowly in her chair. And how does that make you feel? Seraphina laughed quietly without humor. Furious. Because where was this concern before? Where was this attention while she slowly disappeared beside him year after year? Theodore only noticed her absence once it finally became impossible to ignore physically. The realization tasted bitter beneath her tongue. She stood suddenly and crossed toward the windows again with the telegram still clenched lightly in one hand. Fog thickened outside now. Boston disappearing slowly into evening shadows and gaslight. He is not a cruel man, she said quietly after several moments. Eleanor raised one eyebrow slightly. No. Cruel men enjoy suffering. Seraphina stared out toward the harbor beyond distant rooftops. Theodore simply never realized I was capable of it. The distinction mattered somehow. Eleanor remained silent. Seraphina unfolded the telegram again slowly. Please tell me where you are staying. I only want to know you are safe. Safe. The word lingered strangely in her chest. Theodore always protected practically. Financially. Socially, physically, but emotional protection required something entirely different. Tension, presence, vulnerability, things powerful men often struggle to offer because they spent entire lives believing provision alone counted as love. Are you going to answer him? Eleanor asked carefully. Seraphina looked down at the telegram once more before walking toward the fireplace. Flames shifted gold across her face while she held the paper above the fire grate thoughtfully. No, she whispered. Then she released it. The telegram curled black almost immediately as flames consumed the edges first. Theodore's words disappeared slowly into ash. Eleanor watched silently while Seraphina stared into the fire with eyes that looked older than 27 now. Do you know what the worst part is? Seraphina asked softly. Eleanor shook her head once. Seraphina swallowed carefully. A small part of me still wants him to come after me. The confession hung fragile and ashamed in the warm room. Eleanor's expression gentled immediately. That does not make you weak. No, Seraphina said quietly. It makes me human. Outside, evening settled fully over Boston, while fog swallowed the streets below and distant church bells rang through the darkening city. Somewhere nearly 200 miles south, Theodore Ashbourne was probably standing inside Blackthorne Manor, finally realizing how silent a life became once the woman holding it together stopped pretending she could survive on half-loved affection forever. Seraphina closed her eyes briefly against the firelight. And despite everything, despite the heartbreak and humiliation and loneliness, one terrifying question still whispered quietly beneath all the others. If he came for her now, would she truly be strong enough to refuse him? 3 days after Seraphina vanished from Blackthorne Manor, Theodore Ashbourne arrived in Boston beneath a sky the color of bruised steel. The private train pulled into North Station just after 7 o'clock in the evening, while freezing rain drifted across the platform in thin silver lines. A driver waited beside the station entrance holding a black umbrella against the rain. "Mr. Ashbourne?" Theodore nodded once. "Mrs. Whitcomb requested I bring you directly to Beacon Hill, sir." Of course Eleanor knew he would come eventually. Theodore climbed into the waiting car without another word. The city rolled past behind rain-streaked windows while gas lamps reflected gold across wet brick streets and fog drifted low between narrow buildings. Boston felt older than New York. Less hungry, less loud. Theodore hated how easily he imagined Seraphina belonging here already. The thought unsettled him more than expected. She always adapted quietly. Theodore used to admire that quality. Now he wondered how many sacrifices hid inside it. By the time the car stopped outside Eleanor Whitcomb's townhouse, rain had turned heavier again. Theodore stepped onto the slick pavement and stared upward toward the warm amber windows glowing behind black iron railings. One of those windows belonged to Seraphina now. The realization tightened painfully somewhere beneath his ribs. The driver opened the gate silently. Theodore climbed the stone steps slowly for perhaps the first time in his life, uncertain whether power or money or reputation could help him once the door opened. Eleanor answered after the second knock. She wore a dark green wool dress with her silver blonde hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. Her expression remained completely unreadable when she saw him standing there in the rain. "You look terrible," she said calmly. Theodore almost laughed at the bluntness. "Good evening to you as well." Eleanor leaned one shoulder lightly against the doorway without inviting him inside immediately. "You should go home." Theodore met her gaze steadily. "I am not leaving without speaking to her." Eleanor studied him carefully for several long seconds. "And what exactly do you intend to say?" Theodore opened his mouth immediately, then stopped, because he genuinely did not know. Sorry sounded insultingly small compared to the damage waiting between them. Eleanor noticed the hesitation instantly. "That is what I thought." She started closing the door. Theodore caught it gently before it shut fully. "Please." The word left him quieter than intended. Human. Tired. Eleanor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly at the sound of it. "She finally slept this afternoon," she said softly. "For the first time since leaving you." Theodore looked away briefly toward the rain-swept street below. Guilt moved through him again, sharp as broken glass. "I only need 5 minutes." Eleanor hesitated, then sighed softly and stepped aside from the doorway. 5. Warmth wrapped around Theodore immediately as he entered the townhouse. Firelight, books, the scent of tea and cedarwood drifting through quiet hallways. Lived-in warmth. Not staged perfection like Blackthorne Manor. Eleanor closed the door behind him while removing her gloves slowly. "She is upstairs in the library." Theodore's eyes lifted toward the second floor automatically. His pulse had started behaving strangely during the train ride north. Too fast. Uneven. Ridiculous for a man who negotiated million-dollar contracts without blinking. Eleanor watched him carefully beside the staircase. "If you hurt her again," she said quietly, "I will personally make your life miserable." Theodore almost smiled faintly despite himself. Noted. The library door stood partially open at the end of the upstairs corridor. Warm golden light spilled softly across the dark carpet beneath it. Theodore stopped outside for exactly 3 seconds before pushing the door open slowly. Seraphina sat beside the fireplace wearing a cream-colored sweater and dark wool skirt with one book resting forgotten in her lap. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders instead of pinned elegantly like it always had at Blackthorne Manor. She looked softer here somehow, less carefully contained. The moment she saw him standing in the doorway, all color drained slowly from her face. Silence crashed between them instantly. Theodore suddenly understood why storms frighten sailors. "Seraphina." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the book in her lap. "What are you doing here?" No warmth. No relief. Just exhaustion. Theodore stepped fully inside the room while closing the door quietly behind him. I needed to see you. Seraphina stood immediately. You should not have come. Theodore looked at her carefully for the first time since she disappeared before dawn. God, he missed her. The realization struck with terrifying force. Not the idea of her. Not her usefulness. The quiet intelligence in her eyes. The calmness in her voice. The way she filled silence without demanding attention from it. Theodore swallowed once before speaking again. You left without telling me where you were going. Seraphina laughed softly then. The sound carried no humor whatsoever. That was rather the point. Theodore flinched almost invisibly. Seraphina. No, she placed the book aside abruptly and crossed toward the windows overlooking the rain-dark street below. Distance. Even now she instinctively created distance between them. You do not get to stand here acting wounded because I finally left. Theodore stared at her rigid back while rain struck the windows behind her in soft, relentless rhythm. I know I hurt you. Seraphina turned sharply then. Do you? The question hit harder than anger. Theodore held her gaze steadily. Yes. No. She whispered immediately. You know you made a mistake. That is not the same thing. Silence followed. Theodore realized suddenly that this was the first honest emotional conversation they had in years. Maybe ever. The thought horrified him. Seraphina crossed her arms tightly across herself as though physically holding her composure together. You whispered my sister's name while sleeping beside me, she said quietly. Do you understand what that felt like? Theodore looked down briefly toward the carpet. I was dreaming. Seraphina laughed again. Smaller this time. Sadder. Exactly. Theodore's chest tightened painfully. Seraphina, I never meant... Please stop saying that. Her voice finally cracked slightly beneath the calm. Do you think intentions change what happened to me? Theodore fell silent immediately. Because no, they did not. Seraphina turned away from him again toward the windows. Do you know what the cruelest part was? She asked softly. I was not even surprised. Theodore stared at her motionless silhouette against the rain-covered glass. What does that mean? It means some part of me always knew I was standing beside a man emotionally reaching for someone else. The words hollowed something inside him instantly. Theodore took one step closer carefully. That is not true. Seraphina turned toward him slowly then. Tears shimmered faintly in her eyes now though none fell. Then tell me honestly, Theodore. Her voice lowered almost to a whisper. If Vivian had loved you back years ago, would you have ever looked at me twice? The room went still. Theodore opened his mouth automatically. Nothing came out, because he did not know. And she saw that. God, she saw it immediately in his silence. Seraphina closed her eyes briefly like someone finally watching the last fragile hope inside her die completely. There it is, she whispered. Theodore moved toward her instantly. Seraphina, listen to me. She stepped backward before he could touch her. The movement hurt more than he expected. No, you listen to me. Her voice remained quiet. That somehow made every word devastating. I spent 3 years trying to become enough for a man who never truly chose me first. Theodore felt the accusation physically, like impact against bone. That is not fair. Fair. She stared at him in disbelief now. You married me because my sister left. You loved the quieter version of disappointment after the woman you actually wanted disappeared. Theodore's jaw tightened sharply. That is not why I married you. Then why did you? Silence again. Terrible silence. Theodore suddenly realized he had built entire industries faster than he understood his own marriage. He cared about Seraphina. Deeply. Desperately perhaps. But somewhere beneath that truth lingered another one far uglier. She had entered his life originally as consolation for losing Vivian. And no matter what grew afterward, Seraphina lived every day inside the shadow of that beginning. Theodore looked at her helplessly for the first time in his adult life. I do not know how to answer that correctly. Seraphina's expression broke then. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of heartbreak that looked exhausted instead of explosive. That, she whispered, is why I had to leave." Rain battered the windows harder outside, while firelight trembled softly across the room between them. Theodore stood completely still, watching the woman he finally realized he loved look at him like a stranger she no longer trusted with her heart. And for the first time since arriving in Boston, he understood something terrifying. Seraphina was not waiting for him to fix this. She was deciding whether she could survive loving him at all anymore. Theodore did not leave immediately after her words shattered the room between them. He stood there beneath the warm library light while rain pressed softly against the windows and Seraphina remained near the fireplace with her arms wrapped tightly around herself like armor. Neither of them moved for several long seconds. The silence felt alive now, heavy with truths they should have spoken years earlier. Finally Theodore spoke quietly. "I deserve that." Seraphina blinked once as though the answer surprised her. Theodore looked exhausted suddenly. Not powerful. Not intimidating. Just a man standing inside the ruins of something he finally understood too late. "You are right," he continued softly. "I did not see you clearly when we married." Seraphina swallowed carefully but said nothing. Theodore took another step toward her slowly. Careful now, like approaching something wounded enough to disappear if startled again. "But somewhere along the way," he said, "you became the person I trusted most in this world." Seraphina laughed quietly beneath her breath. Sadness lived inside the sound. "That is not the same thing as love." Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. "No," he admitted. "It is not." The honesty of it unsettled her more than denial would have. Seraphina looked away toward the fire flickering softly across the library walls. Books lined every shelf from floor to ceiling. Eleanor's house felt warm in ways Blackthorne Manor never truly managed. Theodore noticed that now too. Seraphina belonged in rooms where people breathed honestly. Not inside cold marble hallways where everyone performed perfection until loneliness became furniture. Theodore watched her profile against the firelight. Loose blonde hair. Pale skin still tired from sleepless nights. She looked heartbreakingly beautiful to him right then. Not because she resembled memory or fantasy. Because she looked real. Human. Hurt. And God help him, Theodore realized he wanted to spend the rest of his life learning how to deserve standing beside her properly. The realization frightened him. "I never asked whether you were happy," he said quietly. Seraphina's eyes closed briefly at the words. "No, I should have." "Yes." Every answer landed softly. No screaming. No dramatic cruelty. Somehow the calmness made the conversation unbearable. Theodore rubbed one hand across his mouth slowly before speaking again. "Do you know what Holloway said to me the morning you left?" Seraphina finally looked toward him again cautiously. Theodore's voice lowered. "He said some things are only invisible to the person causing them." Pain flickered across her face before she masked it carefully again. "That was kind of him." Theodore stared at her steadily. "No, it was devastating." Silence stretched once more. Rain softened outside into faint silver whispers against the glass. Somewhere downstairs a clock chimed 8 slow notes through the townhouse. Seraphina moved toward the armchair near the fireplace finally, as though exhaustion no longer allowed standing upright beneath the weight of the conversation. She sat carefully with both hands folded in her lap. Theodore remained where he was. Distance still existing between them physically because emotional distance already filled the room enough. "I used to wait for you," Seraphina said quietly after a long pause. Theodore listened without interrupting. "Every night during our first year of marriage." Her eyes remained fixed on the fire instead of him. "You would come home late from meetings or dinners or train inspections, and I would stay awake because I thought eventually you would walk into our room and look happy to see me." Theodore felt something twist painfully in his chest. "Seraphina." She shook her head lightly before continuing. "At first I told myself you were simply reserved, busy, exhausted." A faint sad smile touched her mouth briefly. "Then I started measuring affection in smaller things." Theodore stared at her motionlessly. "What things?" "Whether you remembered how I took my tea." Her voice remained soft, controlled. "Whether you noticed when I changed my hair." Whether you reached for my hand first in public or only after someone else was watching. Theodore closed his eyes briefly. God. Eventually, she whispered. You stop asking for love directly because disappointment becomes humiliating after a while. Theodore felt every word like impact beneath his ribs. Because he remembered pieces now. Seraphina quietly waiting awake beside the fire when he returned after midnight from Chicago negotiations. Her face brightening subtly whenever he entered rooms before she quickly hid it again. The way she always looked slightly surprised any time he showed unexpected tenderness, like she no longer trusted it enough to expect it naturally. Theodore had mistaken her quietness for emotional stability. Now he understood it was loneliness learning how to survive with dignity. Why did you never tell me? He asked softly. Seraphina looked at him then. Truly looked at him. Would you have listened? Theodore opened his mouth immediately. Nothing came out. The silence answered for him. Seraphina looked back toward the fire again. That is what I thought. Theodore crossed the room slowly then and stopped near the fireplace. Closer now. Still not close enough to touch her. I am listening now. Seraphina laughed faintly. Yes, after I disappeared. The words cut cleanly because they were true. Theodore lowered his gaze toward the carpet beneath them. I know. Another silence followed. Softer this time. More exhausted than angry. Theodore studied the books lining Eleanor's shelves while trying to gather thoughts that refused to form neatly. He built companies from chaos. Negotiated impossible deals. Controlled entire rooms with a single sentence when necessary. None of those skills helped him here. Because Seraphina did not need strategy from him. She needed truth. Raw and unprotected. Theodore was not certain he had ever spoken that way to anyone before. When I woke up and saw the ring, he said quietly, I thought I was angry at first. Seraphina's expression remained unreadable. Theodore continued slowly. Then I realized the house itself felt wrong. He looked toward her carefully. Not empty. Wrong. Something flickered in her eyes at that. Theodore took another breath. Every room reminded me of you. Every schedule. Every conversation. I could not walk through Blackthorne Manor without realizing how much of my life only functioned because you quietly held it together. Seraphina's gaze lowered slightly toward her folded hands. Theodore's voice roughened faintly. But it was not the practical things that hurt most. She looked back up then. Theodore met her eyes fully for the first time since arriving in Boston. It was realizing I no longer knew where you were. Silence. Deep and trembling. I kept imagining you somewhere cold, he admitted quietly. Or frightened. Or believing no one would come after you. Seraphina inhaled shakily once. Theodore saw it immediately. The crack in her composure. I did come after you, he said softly. The moment I understood you were truly gone. Seraphina stood abruptly then and turned away from him again. Too much. The emotions in the room suddenly pressed too tightly against old wounds. Theodore watched her walk toward the windows overlooking the rain-dark street while she struggled visibly to steady her breathing. You do not get to do this now, she whispered. Theodore frowned faintly. Do what? Seraphina wrapped her arms around herself again without facing him. Become gentle only after I finally stop begging for scraps emotionally. Theodore flinched. You were never begging. She turned sharply toward him. No. Tears finally filled her eyes completely now, though she fought them furiously. I spent 3 years loving a man who looked through me whenever my sister entered a room. Theodore stared at her in stunned silence. Seraphina, that is not. Do not lie to me anymore. Her voice cracked openly this time. Please. The word shattered something inside him. Theodore crossed the remaining distance instinctively before stopping himself inches away from touching her. I am not lying. Seraphina looked up at him with heartbreaking exhaustion. Then tell me honestly. Her voice trembled now despite every effort to control it. When you looked at me during our wedding, did you wish it was her? Theodore froze completely, because memory answered before he could. The cathedral. White flowers. Society reporters crowding outside. Seraphina standing across from him in ivory silk with nervous hope, hidden carefully behind elegant composure. And somewhere deep inside him back then, yes, a part of him had still been grieving Vivian. Theodore's silence lasted only seconds, but Seraphina saw everything she needed inside it. Her face changed quietly, not shocked anymore, just tired. "Thank you," she whispered. Theodore's chest tightened painfully. "Seraphina." "No," she stepped backward again. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks now. "You finally answered honestly." Theodore looked at her like a man watching something precious slip beyond reach in real time. "I was wrong then." His voice sounded rough, desperate almost. "I know that now." Seraphina shook her head slowly. "That does not erase what happened to me while you figured it out." The truth of that left Theodore speechless, because no apology could return the years she spent feeling second choice inside her own marriage. No confession could undo the nights she waited awake hoping for affection he gave too rarely and noticed too late. Theodore stood helplessly in the warm library while the woman he loved cried quietly in front of him for perhaps the first time since their wedding. And suddenly he understood the full horror of regret. It was not merely losing someone. It was realizing you taught them to doubt their own worth before finally understanding how irreplaceable they truly were. Theodore left Eleanor Whitcomb's townhouse just after midnight beneath freezing rain and a silence so heavy it followed him all the way back to the hotel overlooking Boston Harbor. He barely remembered the drive. Streetlights blurred gold across wet windows while the city disappeared into fog and exhaustion around him. All he could still hear was Seraphina's voice asking the one question he failed to answer fast enough. "When you looked at me during our wedding, did you wish it was her?" Theodore stood inside the dark hotel suite nearly an hour later with his coat still soaked from rain and his untouched whiskey glass resting beside the window overlooking the harbor. Ships moved slowly through the fog below with distant horns echoing mournfully across black water. Usually he loved this view whenever business brought him to Boston. Tonight it looked lonely. Everything looked lonely now. Theodore loosened his tie slowly and stared at his own reflection in the window glass. He looked older somehow. Not physically, emotionally, like regret itself added weight to a man's face. Seraphina cried in front of him tonight. Quietly, not dramatically. God, that somehow destroyed him more. She cried like someone exhausted from carrying heartbreak alone too long. Theodore closed his eyes briefly while memory replayed every small thing he failed to notice during their marriage. The nights she waited awake beside the fire while he worked. The way her smile softened whenever he unexpectedly stayed home for dinner. How carefully she watched his moods during difficult negotiations as though protecting him mattered more than protecting herself. She loved him openly in 1,000 invisible ways. And he spent years mistaking devotion for stability instead of recognizing the courage required to keep loving someone who only reached halfway back emotionally. A knock sounded at the hotel suite door shortly after 1 a.m. Theodore almost ignored it. Then came a second knock followed by the concierge's careful voice. "Mr. Ashbourne? A telegram arrived for you, sir." Theodore crossed the room immediately and opened the door. The concierge handed him the envelope respectfully before disappearing back into the hallway. Theodore recognized Holloway's handwriting instantly across the front. "Urgent." Theodore opened it quickly. "Sir. Miss Vailcrest arrived at Blackthorne Manor this evening unexpectedly. She requested private access to the West Study archives. There appears to have been disagreement regarding documents belonging to Her Grace. Holloway." Theodore frowned sharply while reading the telegram again. Documents. Seraphina maintained nearly every estate record personally. Financial ledgers, correspondence archives, charitable foundation accounts. Theodore suddenly remembered something she once mentioned casually over dinner nearly a year ago. "If anything ever happened between us," she said lightly at the time, "there are truths hidden inside that house you would never notice unless someone showed you where to look." Theodore barely listened then. Now the memory unsettled him deeply. He grabbed the room telephone immediately and called Blackthorne Manor. Holloway answered after the second ring despite the late hour. "Blackthorne Manor. It is Theodore." "Yes, sir." Theodore's voice hardened instantly. "What documents was Vivian searching for?" A pause. "I am uncertain, sir. She requested access to Her Grace's private filing cabinets in the West Study. Theodore straightened slowly. And another hesitation. Her Grace instructed staff years ago that no one except yourself was permitted access to those records. Theodore frowned. Then why was Vivian allowed near them at all? Holloway's voice remained calm. Miss Valecrest implied she was acting in your interest, sir. Theodore felt immediate irritation flash beneath his exhaustion. Did she find anything? I do not believe so. Mrs. Davenport intervened before the cabinets were opened. Theodore walked toward the rain-covered window overlooking the harbor again. Something about the entire situation felt wrong suddenly. Vivian arriving unexpectedly. Searching Seraphina's private records the same night Theodore finally confronted the reality of his marriage. What exactly did Vivian say? He asked quietly. Holloway hesitated carefully before answering. She suggested Her Grace may have hidden financial correspondence capable of embarrassing the family publicly. Theodore went still. That is absurd. Yes, sir. Theodore stared out toward the black water below while unease moved slowly through him. Seraphina protected Blackthorne Manor obsessively. Even after leaving him, she would never deliberately create scandal. Unless, Theodore frowned harder, unless she discovered something first. Holloway, sir, do not allow anyone into Seraphina's study until I return. Of course. Theodore ended the call slowly before looking back toward the telegram still resting in his hand. Rain continued striking the hotel windows while distant ship horns echoed through the harbor below. Something was shifting beneath the surface of everything now. Theodore could feel it. The marriage collapsing. Vivian acting strangely. Seraphina leaving with more certainty than simple heartbreak should have created. Theodore suddenly remembered another detail from earlier that evening in Eleanor's library. Right before he left, Seraphina almost said something else. He saw it in her face. Fear mixed with exhaustion. Then she swallowed the words and turned away instead. Theodore moved toward the desk inside the hotel suite and sat heavily in the leather chair. His mind replayed the last several years differently now that denial no longer protected him. Vivian visited Blackthorne Manor far too often during their marriage. At first Theodore barely questioned it. Seraphina never objected openly. But looking back now, strange moments surfaced sharply. Vivian interrupting anniversaries unexpectedly. Casual remarks comparing Seraphina to her younger self. Tiny comments whispered during dinners that always left Seraphina quieter afterward. Theodore once dismissed those moments as harmless sisterly tension. Now uncertainty crawled slowly through him. Had he truly seen the women around him clearly at all? Another memory surfaced suddenly. 8 months earlier during a charity gala in Manhattan. Theodore and Seraphina argued quietly before leaving because he canceled their planned trip to Maine for another business meeting. He remembered Seraphina looking more hurt than angry that night. Later Vivian found him alone near the ballroom terrace with champagne in hand. You know, she said lightly at the time, Seraphina has always loved you more than you deserve. That kind of devotion becomes dangerous eventually. Theodore interpreted it as teasing then. Now the memory felt different somehow. Sharper. Theodore leaned back slowly in the chair while rain blurred the city outside. God, how many things had he ignored simply because paying attention emotionally felt inconvenient? He built entire empires on observation and instinct. Yet somehow he remained blind inside his own marriage for years. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts again near 2 a.m. This time Eleanor stood outside the hotel suite doorway wearing a dark wool coat over her nightdress with silver rain clinging to loose strands of hair around her face. Theodore looked genuinely surprised. What are you doing here? Eleanor stepped inside immediately before answering. Seraphina is gone. Theodore's entire body stiffened. What? Eleanor closed the door behind her sharply. I woke up 20 minutes ago and found her room empty. Cold panic moved through Theodore instantly. Did she leave a note? No, Theodore grabbed his coat from the chair without hesitation. Where would she go? Eleanor looked furious now. Not at him exactly, at the situation itself. I do not know, but something frightened her after you left tonight. Theodore's jaw tightened sharply. Frightened, Eleanor crossed her arms. She kept asking strange questions after you were gone. What questions? Eleanor hesitated briefly. About whether wealthy men could bury scandals quietly if necessary. Theodore stared at her. What the hell does that mean? I was hoping you would know. Theodore moved immediately toward the hotel suite door. Did she take luggage? Only one bag. Money? Some. Theodore's pulse hammered unevenly now beneath controlled calm. Seraphina leaving Blackthorne Manor made emotional sense. But disappearing again in the middle of the night after he found her? That felt different. More urgent. Theodore stopped suddenly near the doorway and looked toward Eleanor sharply. Did she say anything specific before she left? Eleanor thought carefully. Then her expression changed slightly. Actually, yes. Theodore waited. Eleanor's voice lowered. She said she finally understood why Vivian worked so hard to keep her marriage broken. Silence crashed through the room instantly. Theodore stared at her motionlessly, while something cold and terrible began unfolding slowly in his chest. What did you just say? Eleanor shook her head faintly. I asked what she meant. She would not answer. Theodore's thoughts raced violently now. Vivian searching Seraphina's study. Seraphina disappearing again after mentioning her sister specifically. Years of subtle tension Theodore dismissed because he assumed women simply complicated each other emotionally sometimes. God. Theodore suddenly remembered another detail from months ago. Seraphina once stopped speaking entirely for nearly 3 days after returning from lunch with Vivian in Manhattan. Theodore asked if something happened. She smiled faintly and said, No, I simply learned something important. He never asked what. Theodore closed his eyes briefly while dread settled fully into his bloodstream for the first time that night. Maybe Seraphina did not only leave because he whispered the wrong name in bed. Maybe she finally discovered something far more dangerous than heartbreak. And somewhere out in the rain-soaked city beyond the harbor, the woman he loved was now alone carrying truths Theodore no longer understood at all. Boston before dawn looked like a city trying to disappear. Fog rolled thick between narrow streets while harbor wind carried freezing rain across empty sidewalks and dark storefront windows. Theodore stood beneath the iron awning outside Eleanor Whitcomb's townhouse at 3:17 in the morning with his coat collar turned sharply against the cold and dread settling deeper into his chest with every passing minute Seraphina remained missing again. Eleanor stood beside him holding one gloved hand tightly around the railing as another carriage disappeared through the fog at the far end of the street. She could not have gone far, she said quietly. Theodore did not answer immediately, because instinct told him otherwise. Seraphina did not run impulsively. If she vanished twice in 1 week, then something truly frightened her. Theodore replayed every conversation from the past 24 hours while searching for details he missed. Vivian arriving unexpectedly at Blackthorne Manor. The study archives. Seraphina asking strange questions about hidden scandals. And beneath all of it, a terrible possibility beginning to form slowly. What if Vivian had not merely complicated their marriage emotionally? What if she deliberately poisoned it? The thought sounded absurd at first. Yet the more Theodore remembered, the less impossible it felt. Mr. Ashbourne. Theodore turned sharply as Eleanor's housekeeper hurried down the front staircase carrying a folded note. This was discovered beneath Miss Seraphina's bedroom door after you departed earlier. Theodore took the paper instantly. His pulse hammered once hard beneath his ribs when he recognized Seraphina's handwriting immediately. Not a letter. Just one hurried sentence written across cream stationery. Some truths destroy families when they finally surface. Theodore read the line twice beneath the dim gaslight while cold moved slowly through his bloodstream. Eleanor stepped closer. What does it say? Theodore handed her the note silently. She frowned while reading it. What truth? Theodore looked toward the fog-covered street ahead. I think we are about to find out. Another memory surfaced sharply then. Nearly a year ago during a dinner party at Blackthorne Manor. Vivian laughing softly beside the fireplace while Seraphina stood quietly near the piano speaking with charity investors. Theodore remembered asking Vivian whether she envied her sister's marriage. Vivian smiled into her champagne glass before answering lightly, Some women are very good at surviving crumbs emotionally. At the time Theodore thought she sounded bitter. Now he wondered if something darker hid beneath the comment entirely. Theodore. Eleanor's voice pulled him back. Where would Seraphina go alone at this hour? Theodore stared into the thick fog drifting through the street while his thoughts moved rapidly now. Seraphina always went somewhere quiet when overwhelmed emotionally. Libraries, gardens, churches during winter evenings when Manhattan became too loud. Then suddenly he remembered something she once told him during their second year of marriage. "If I ever disappeared completely," she said while they walked through Central Park beneath falling snow, "I think I would go somewhere near the ocean. Water makes people feel honest." Theodore looked toward the harbor immediately. The docks. Eleanor frowned. At this hour? Boston Harbor never sleeps. Theodore was already moving toward the waiting car at the curb. "Come on." The harbor district looked almost ghostly before sunrise. Cargo ships loomed through heavy fog while ropes creaked against wooden piers and distant horns echoed across black water. Theodore stepped from the car near Pier 17 with rain soaking instantly through his coat again. The smell of salt and cold iron filled the air. Dockworkers moved like shadows through drifting mist farther down the waterfront. Eleanor followed beside him while wrapping her coat tighter against the wind. "How are we supposed to find her in this?" Theodore barely heard her, because suddenly he saw something ahead through the fog. A pale figure standing near the far end of the pier beside dark water, moving endlessly beneath weak harbor lights. Seraphina. Relief hit Theodore so hard it almost felt painful. He crossed the wet wooden boards quickly before she could disappear again. "Seraphina." She turned sharply at the sound of his voice. Wind caught loose strands of blonde hair around her face while her dark coat whipped softly behind her near the edge of the pier. She looked startled, then tired, then quietly resigned. "How did you find me?" Theodore stopped several feet away from her, close enough now to see the fear still lingering behind her eyes. "You left a note." Seraphina looked away immediately toward the black water beyond the harbor. "I should not have." Eleanor approached more slowly behind Theodore before wisely remaining several steps back near the entrance of the pier. Seraphina wrapped her arms tightly around herself against the freezing wind. "You should not be here." Theodore stared at her carefully. "You keep saying that." "Because it is true." Rain drifted lightly between them now while fog swallowed most of the harbor beyond the pier. Theodore looked at her pale, exhausted face beneath the weak lights overhead. "What frightened you?" Seraphina went still immediately. Too still. Theodore noticed that at once. "Nothing. Do not lie to me now." Her eyes flashed toward him sharply. "That is almost funny coming from you." Theodore accepted the hit without reacting. "Seraphina." She looked back toward the water instead of him. "You should go back to New York." Theodore frowned. "Not without you. Especially without me." The words landed strangely. Wrong somehow. Theodore stepped closer carefully. "What is going on? What letters?" Seraphina reached slowly into her coat pocket and removed a small bundle of folded papers tied together with faded blue ribbon. Theodore recognized the ribbon instantly. Blackthorne Manor archive ribbon. Seraphina held the letters tightly in one hand while harbor wind fluttered the edges. These were hidden inside the West Study archives behind old financial ledgers. Theodore stared at them. "What are they?" Seraphina's eyes filled with exhaustion. "Letters from Vivian." Theodore frowned sharply. "To who?" Silence. Then quietly, "To me." Rain struck the wooden pier harder around them now while distant ship horns echoed through the fog like warnings. Theodore felt something dangerous shift slowly beneath his ribs. "What did they say?" Seraphina laughed softly then. The sound nearly broke him. "That depends which year you read first." She looked down toward the letters in her hands. Some were apologies. Some were cruel. Most of them— her voice faltered slightly. "Most of them described how carefully she made sure I never felt secure beside you." Theodore stared at her motionlessly. "No, yes." Seraphina lifted tear-filled eyes toward him again. "Vivian knew exactly how much I loved you from the beginning. And she hated me for it." Theodore's pulse thundered unevenly now. That does not make sense. It does if you understand Vivian. Seraphina's voice remained painfully calm. She never wanted you enough to stay. She simply never wanted me to have you either. The harbor seemed to disappear around Theodore for one terrible moment. Memory after memory suddenly rearranged itself violently inside his mind. Vivian's constant interruptions, the comparisons, the comments whispered strategically over years, the emotional distance growing steadily inside his marriage while Seraphina quietly absorbed wound after wound, believing most of them originated from Theodore himself. God. Theodore looked at the letters in her trembling hands. Why did you not tell me immediately? Seraphina's eyes closed briefly. Because after hearing your voice whisper her name in bed. She swallowed hard before continuing. I could not survive discovering she was right too. Theodore felt those words physically, like impact against his chest. Seraphina looked exhausted now beneath the harbor lights. Exhausted in the way only long-term heartbreak creates. I kept wondering whether our marriage failed because of manipulation, she whispered. Or because some part of you truly always loved her more. Theodore stepped closer immediately. Seraphina. She shook her head quickly. Do not answer yet. Her voice trembled now despite every effort to steady it. Because if you hesitate again, I think it will finally destroy whatever is left of me completely. Theodore stood frozen beneath the harbor lights while rain drifted across the pier and Seraphina trembled only a few feet away holding years of hidden cruelty in her hands. The letters shook faintly against the cold wind. Theodore could barely breathe past the realization crashing through him piece by piece. Vivian knew. She knew how deeply Seraphina loved him. And instead of stepping away, she spent years feeding insecurity into the marriage quietly enough that no one noticed until everything finally broke apart. Theodore looked at the faded blue ribbon wrapped around the letters. How many are there? Seraphina lowered her eyes toward them. 23. Theodore felt physically sick. Jesus Christ. Eleanor remained farther down the pier near the entrance wrapped tightly in her coat while giving them distance, though Theodore could feel her watching carefully through the fog and rain. Seraphina untied the ribbons slowly with numb fingers. I only found them yesterday. Theodore's voice roughened. Why were they hidden inside your study archives? Seraphina laughed quietly without humor. Because Vivian knew I handled all estate records personally. She probably assumed I would eventually discover them when she wanted me to. Theodore stared at her in disbelief. Wanted you to? Seraphina pulled one letter carefully from the stack. The paper looked worn at the edges from years hidden away. Vivian enjoyed emotional timing. Her voice shook faintly now. She liked planting damage slowly. Theodore remembered suddenly how often Vivian appeared whenever his marriage seemed happiest. Anniversary dinners interrupted unexpectedly. Last-minute invitations. Casual comments whispered with smiling elegance that somehow always left Seraphina quieter afterward. God. Theodore had mistaken manipulation for sophistication because he never truly examined it closely enough. Seraphina unfolded the first letter carefully, while harbor wind pushed loose blonde strands across her face. This one arrived 6 months after our wedding, she said softly. Theodore watched her expression harden slightly before she began reading aloud. You have always confused gratitude with love, little sister. Theodore married you because I left first. Please do not embarrass yourself pretending otherwise. Theodore felt cold fury rise instantly beneath his skin. She wrote that to you? Seraphina nodded once without looking at him. Men like Theodore Ashbourne do not fall deeply for women they consider safe. They marry them because safety feels convenient after disappointment. Theodore closed his eyes briefly. Stop. Seraphina's gaze lifted toward him slowly. Why? Theodore looked genuinely shaken now. Because none of that was true. Seraphina swallowed hard. I know that now. Theodore frowned faintly. Now? Pain flickered across her face again. I did not before. The truth landed brutally between them. Theodore stared out across the black water beyond the pier, while guilt and rage tangled violently together inside him. Because Vivian's manipulation only worked because Theodore himself created enough emotional distance for Seraphina to believe the lies possible. That realization cut deepest. "There is more," Seraphina whispered. Theodore looked back toward her immediately. She unfolded another letter slowly. "You watch him constantly and he barely notices." Her voice nearly broke reading it. "I almost pity you for loving a man who still looks for me every time I enter a room." Theodore inhaled sharply through his nose. "God!" Seraphina lowered the letter with trembling fingers. "The worst part is that sometimes she was right." Theodore stepped toward her immediately. "No, yes." Tears filled her eyes again beneath the harbor lights. "You did look at her differently once." Theodore stared at her helplessly. "Because yes, years ago he did. Before he understood the difference between fascination and peace. Between desire and home." Theodore moved closer carefully through the rain. "Seraphina, listen to me." She looked exhausted now, hollowed out from too many years carrying quiet wounds alone. "No, you listen." Her voice trembled despite her effort to steady it. "Every time Vivian visited Blackthorne Manor, she found ways to remind me I came second." Theodore's jaw tightened hard. "You should have told me." Seraphina laughed softly through tears. "Would you have believed me?" Silence answered again. Theodore hated himself for it. Because years ago he honestly might not have. Vivian mastered charm too perfectly. She weaponized elegance. Theodore saw that now with horrifying clarity. Seraphina unfolded another letter with slow, shaking hands. "You know what the saddest thing about your marriage is?" She read quietly. "You are trying so hard to become someone unforgettable for a man who never stopped comparing you to me privately." Theodore reached for the papers instinctively. "Enough." Seraphina stepped back before he could take them. "No. You need to understand what happened to me." Theodore froze. Rain fell harder around them now while harbor fog drifted across the wooden pier in pale silver waves. Seraphina looked directly at him with raw heartbreak stripped entirely bare now. "I spent years wondering whether every insecurity inside me belonged to reality or manipulation." Theodore's chest tightened painfully. "Seraphina, do you know what that does to a person?" she whispered. "Never knowing whether the pain is true?" Theodore said nothing because he finally understood. Vivian planted doubt slowly enough that Seraphina questioned her own instincts instead of questioning the source. And Theodore, God, Theodore unknowingly reinforced it through emotional neglect year after year. "I should have protected you," he said quietly. Seraphina's eyes closed briefly at that. "Yes." The simple answer nearly destroyed him. Theodore stepped closer again. "I did not know." "I know you did not." Tears slipped silently down her cheeks now. "That is what makes this so tragic." Theodore stared at her while rain soaked through both their coats unnoticed. Seraphina looked fragile tonight in ways he had never allowed himself to see before. Not weak, just tired from surviving too long without emotional safety. Theodore's voice lowered almost to a whisper. "Why did Vivian keep the letters?" Seraphina looked down at them again. "Because she wanted control." Theodore frowned. "Over what?" A long silence followed before Seraphina answered softly. "Over being the woman who mattered most to both of us." Theodore felt anger sharpen instantly then, cold and precise. For the first time in years, he looked at Vivian not through nostalgia or habit but with complete clarity. She never loved him enough to stay, but she loved being wanted enough to destroy anyone who threatened replacing her emotionally. "She was jealous of you," Theodore said suddenly. Seraphina blinked once in surprise. "What?" Theodore moved closer still until only inches separated them now. "Vivian fascinated people. But you," his voice roughened slightly, "you made them feel safe." Seraphina stared at him silently through rain and fog. Theodore continued quietly. "I trusted you with every important part of my life long before I understood why." Pain moved across her expression again. "That was never enough." "No," Theodore swallowed hard. "Because I failed to make sure you knew it mattered." Silence settled around them while distant harbor horns echoed softly through the dark. Theodore looked down toward the letters still trembling in her hands. "Did you read them all?" Seraphina nodded faintly. "Every one. And after all that, Theodore's voice nearly failed him for the first time. You still thought I loved her more. Seraphina looked away toward the black water beyond the pier. You whispered her name in bed. Theodore closed his eyes briefly. God, that moment again. One exhausted mistake powerful enough to collapse years of quiet suffering all at once. When he opened his eyes, Seraphina looked heartbreakingly small against the endless dark harbor behind her. I need you to hear me now, Theodore said carefully. She remained silent. Theodore took another step forward. I thought I loved Vivian once because she challenged me. Rain slid slowly down his face unnoticed. She was beautiful and difficult and impossible to predict. Men confuse that with love all the time. Seraphina looked at him cautiously now. Theodore's voice lowered further. But every meaningful thing in my life became attached to you. Her breath caught faintly. Theodore continued steadily despite the emotion tightening his chest. Every room I considered home. Every success I wanted to share. Every difficult day that became bearable because you existed at the end of it. Seraphina's eyes filled completely again. Theodore looked directly at her now with devastating honesty. Vivian occupied my ego once. You occupied my life. Silence swallowed the pier whole after that. Even the rain seemed quieter suddenly. Seraphina stared at him like someone terrified to believe what she desperately wanted true. Theodore's expression softened painfully. I know I realized it too late. His voice broke slightly on the final word. But God, Seraphina, I love you. She inhaled sharply. Theodore stepped closer one final time. Not because you are safe. Not because you stayed. Not because you loved me first. His eyes never left hers now. I love you because losing you finally showed me what my life actually was when stripped down to truth. Seraphina looked shattered by the confession. Hope and grief and exhaustion colliding visibly behind her eyes. Theodore reached toward her slowly, then stopped inches away from touching her face. Waiting. Giving her the choice he failed to give emotionally for years. I do not expect forgiveness tonight, he whispered. But please do not believe for another second that you were ever second in my heart once I truly understood what love meant. And standing there beneath rain and harbor fog with years of regret bleeding quietly between them, Theodore Ashbourne finally gave Seraphina the one thing she had begged for silently since the beginning of their marriage. Not admiration. Not dependence. Not gratitude. The truth. Seraphina did not answer him immediately. Rain moved softly across the harbor while fog curled between distant ships, and Theodore stood inches away from her with years of regret stripped bare beneath the weak pier lights. His confession still lingered between them, fragile as glass. I love you. Words she spent 3 years starving for. Words arriving only after everything beautiful between them already cracked apart. Seraphina looked at him with tears shining silently in her eyes. You cannot say things like that now, she whispered. Theodore's expression tightened painfully. Why not? A sad laugh escaped her softly. Because some part of me still wants to believe you. The honesty in it nearly undid him. Theodore lowered his hand slowly instead of touching her, giving her space, choice, respect he should have understood years ago. I am not asking you to trust me immediately, he said quietly. I am asking you to know the truth. Seraphina stared at him beneath the rain while wind tugged gently at the edges of her coat. And what exactly is the truth, Theodore? He answered without hesitation this time. That losing you terrified me more than realizing Vivian manipulated us. Her breath caught faintly. Theodore stepped closer again carefully. Because the moment you disappeared, I understood something I should have seen years ago. His voice roughened. Every meaningful part of my life already belonged to you. Seraphina looked away quickly toward the dark harbor water. The vulnerability in his voice frightened her because it sounded real. Too real. Theodore noticed her trembling hands still clutching the letters against her chest. Come back with me, he whispered softly. She closed her eyes immediately. No, Theodore inhaled slowly through the rain-heavy air. Seraphina, I cannot. Her voice cracked slightly now. Not yet. Theodore watched her carefully. Because you do not believe me? She shook her head faintly. Because I finally started believing myself. Silence settled between them again. Theodore understood then. This was no longer only about whether she loved him. It was about whether she could survive loving him without disappearing inside the relationship again. And for the first time in his life, Theodore realized love was not proven through intensity. It was proven through safety. "What do you need from me?" he asked quietly. Seraphina looked genuinely startled by the question. Theodore continued before she could answer. "Not what society expects. Not what marriage requires. You." Rain slid slowly down his face while harbor lights shimmered weakly through fog behind him. "What do you need in order to stop hurting when you look at me?" Seraphina swallowed hard. No one had ever asked her that before. Not truly. Her entire life revolved around adjusting herself to other people's emotional needs while quietly ignoring her own. Theodore saw the realization move across her face slowly. "I do not know," she admitted finally. Theodore nodded once. "Then we figure it out." The simplicity of the answer nearly broke her composure completely. Seraphina looked down at the letters again. 23 pieces of poison spread carefully across years. Theodore followed her gaze. "Burn them." She blinked once. "What?" Theodore's expression darkened with cold certainty now. "Burn every last one." Seraphina stared at him through rain and fog. "They are evidence of cruelty." His voice sharpened slightly. "Nothing else." She hesitated. "Part of me kept them because I thought maybe one day you would read them and finally understand why I became so afraid of losing you." Theodore stepped forward until only inches separated them again. "I understand now." His eyes held hers steadily. "And I hate that you ever needed proof in order to explain your pain to me." The words settled deep inside her chest. Warm and terrible all at once. Theodore reached slowly toward the letters again. This time she let him take them. His fingers brushed hers briefly in the cold rain. Such a small touch. Still, it felt dangerously intimate after everything broken between them. Theodore looked down at the letters for several long seconds before pulling a silver lighter from inside his coat pocket. Seraphina watched silently while he lit the first page. Flames spread quickly across old paper beneath the harbor wind. Theodore dropped the burning letter carefully into a metal bin chained beside the pier railing. One by one he fed the rest into the fire. Vivian's words curled black and disappeared into ash drifting across rain-soaked wood. Seraphina stood motionless watching years of manipulation vanish slowly into smoke. Theodore burned every letter without reading another line. Not because he feared the truth, because he already knew enough. When the final page dissolved into ash, silence returned around them except for harbor wind and distant ship horns. Theodore looked toward her again. "None of that belongs to you anymore." Seraphina's eyes filled immediately. No one had ever protected her pain like this before. Theodore noticed the tears instantly. "Hey!" His voice softened almost painfully. "Do not cry." She laughed quietly through the tears instead. "That is impossible right now." Theodore almost smiled faintly despite the heaviness between them. God, even heartbroken, she still sounded gentle. The realization hurt. Seraphina wiped quickly beneath one eye before looking back toward the harbor. "What happens now?" Theodore followed her gaze toward the dark water stretching endlessly beyond the city. "I go home eventually." "And me?" Theodore looked at her carefully. "You decide what you want without anyone manipulating you into choosing smaller versions of yourself." The answer stunned her again because old Theodore would have demanded certainty, control, resolution. This version simply looked terrified to lose her while refusing to cage her emotionally anymore. Theodore saw the confusion moving through her expression and understood it immediately. She did not know what to do with tenderness that arrived without conditions attached. "I am still angry with you," she whispered after a long silence. Theodore nodded once. "You should be. Part of me still does not trust you." "I know." Seraphina studied him carefully beneath the harbor lights. "You are taking this rather calmly." Theodore laughed softly then. "Tired. Honest." "No, Seraphina. I am absolutely falling apart." The raw truth in his voice caught her off guard. Theodore looked out toward the black ocean while rain dampened his dark hair against his forehead. But loving you correctly might finally mean allowing you space to hurt instead of demanding immediate forgiveness because it comforts me. Seraphina stared at him silently. Theodore turned back toward her fully. I spent years expecting your loyalty while giving emotional fragments in return. His voice lowered. I will not insult you by asking for trust overnight now. Something inside her shifted painfully at that. Because for the first time since leaving Blackthorne Manor, Theodore sounded like a man seeing her clearly instead of simply reacting to losing her. Eleanor finally approached slowly from the far end of the pier after giving them nearly an hour alone. She looked between them carefully before stopping nearby. It is almost dawn. Theodore glanced toward the eastern horizon where faint gray light slowly began bleeding through the fog. Morning approaching again. Another sunrise after a night that changed everything between them. Seraphina wrapped her coat tighter around herself against the cold. Exhaustion suddenly settled visibly into her face. Theodore noticed immediately. You need sleep. She almost smiled faintly. You sound bossy again. Occupational hazard. The softness between them startled both of them slightly. Tiny. Fragile. But there. Theodore looked at her for several quiet seconds before speaking again. I am staying in Boston for now. Seraphina blinked once. Why? Theodore's answer came instantly. Because I am not leaving while your entire world still feels unstable. Emotion flickered across her face again too quickly to hide fully. Theodore noticed. Of course he noticed now. You do not have to see me every day, he added quietly. But if you need anything, I am here. Seraphina lowered her gaze toward the wet wooden pier beneath them. For years she begged silently for emotional presence from him. Now he offered it freely only after she walked away. The tragedy of that nearly hurt too much to bear. Theodore stepped back, finally giving her more space. Come on, he said softly. Let me take you home. Home. The word lingered strangely between them because neither of them knew what it meant anymore. Blackthorne Manor. Boston. Each other. Nothing felt certain yet. Still, when Theodore offered his hand quietly through the rain, Seraphina hesitated only a moment before placing hers carefully in his. Not forgiveness. Not reunion. Just the first fragile step toward something honest enough to survive daylight. Winter arrived fully in Boston 3 weeks later. Snow covered Beacon Hill in soft white silence while gas lamps glowed gold through early evening fog and carriage wheels carved slow tracks through frozen streets below Eleanor Whitcomb's townhouse. Seraphina stood beside the library windows watching snow fall beyond the glass with a cup of untouched tea warming her hands. The city looked softer during winter. Kinder somehow. She had started sleeping again recently. Not perfectly, but enough to dream without waking in panic. Healing, she discovered, did not arrive dramatically. It arrived quietly, like snow covering old damage overnight. Behind her, the library door opened gently. Theodore stepped inside carrying cold air and the faint scent of cedar and winter smoke from outside. Seraphina turned slowly toward him. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of cautious conversations. Shared breakfasts at Eleanor's insistence. Walks through Boston Common beneath bare trees while learning how to speak honestly to each other for the first time. Theodore no longer pushed. That mattered more than she expected. He simply stayed. Consistently. Patiently. Like a man finally understanding that love was proven through presence instead of possession. Theodore removed his gloves slowly while watching her near the windows. You missed dinner again. Seraphina almost smiled faintly. I was reading. Theodore glanced toward the closed book resting beside her teacup. That usually means you forgot to eat entirely. She tilted her head slightly. You notice things now. Theodore's expression softened with painful honesty. I am trying very hard to deserve noticing them. Silence settled warmly between them. Not awkward anymore. Just quiet. Real. Theodore crossed toward the fireplace while snow drifted steadily outside. He looked different lately too. Less sharp around the edges somehow. The constant tension inside him had changed into something calmer. More human. Seraphina noticed it every day despite herself. Theodore set a leather folder carefully on the table near the fire. I met with the attorneys this afternoon. Seraphina's fingers tightened slightly around the teacup. About Vivian? Theodore nodded once. 1 week earlier, everything finally surfaced publicly. The letters. Financial manipulation hidden through charitable accounts Vivian controlled secretly. Quiet attempts to damage Seraphina's reputation socially whenever Theodore's attention drifted too close emotionally toward his wife. Not criminal. Worse, personal. Deliberate. Cruel in ways difficult to explain to newspapers but devastating inside families. Vivian left New York for Europe again 3 days ago before the full scandal spread publicly through society circles. Theodore did not stop her. Neither did Seraphina. Some endings no longer deserved dramatic confrontations. Just distance. Theodore looked toward the fire briefly before speaking again. She admitted everything privately. Seraphina closed her eyes for one quiet moment. Not relief exactly. Something sadder. Final. Why? Theodore's voice remained low. Because she said watching you become genuinely loved by someone terrified her. Seraphina looked down toward the untouched tea in her hands. Theodore continued carefully. Apparently Vivian believed if she could not inspire lasting devotion herself, then no one else deserved it either. Snow tapped softly against the library windows while silence settled once more. Seraphina felt strangely empty hearing it confirmed aloud. Years of pain reduced to another woman's insecurity. Theodore watched her carefully across the warm room. How do you feel? Seraphina considered the question honestly. Tired. Theodore nodded faintly as though he understood perfectly. Because he did. Regret exhausted him too. Grief for the marriage they almost destroyed through silence and manipulation and emotional cowardice. Still, something hopeful existed beneath the sadness now. Small but growing. Theodore moved closer slowly until he stood beside her near the windows overlooking the snow-covered street. I spoke with Holloway this morning, he said quietly. Seraphina glanced toward him. Theodore's mouth softened slightly. Apparently Blackthorne Manor has become impossible without you. She laughed under her breath. That sounds dramatic. The east wing flooded yesterday because no one realized the winter pipes required additional insulation before heavy snowfall. Seraphina blinked once. Oh no. Theodore almost smiled fully then. Mrs. Davenport burned an entire charity banquet because she forgot you usually corrected the oven temperatures personally. Seraphina stared at him in disbelief before laughing quietly for real this time. The sound filled the library softly. Theodore looked at her like a starving man finally seeing light again. God, he missed that laugh. Seraphina noticed his expression slowly fading back into seriousness. What? Theodore looked down briefly before answering. Nothing. Theodore. He met her eyes then with devastating tenderness. I forgot how beautiful you sound when you are not hurting. The words stole the air from her lungs completely. No manipulation. No performance. Just truth spoken quietly beside falling snow. Seraphina looked away quickly toward the windows because emotion rose too fast inside her chest again. Theodore had changed. Not perfectly, but genuinely. He listened now. Paid attention. Asked questions before assuming silence meant peace. Some mornings she caught him watching her like a man still astonished she existed beside him at all. Frightened her, because part of her still loved him enough to hope. Theodore reached toward the teacup gently and removed it from her hands before setting it aside. Then he looked at her carefully. There is something else. Seraphina's heartbeat slowed unevenly. What? Theodore inhaled once before speaking. I sold the Newport summer estate yesterday. She frowned slightly in confusion. Why? Theodore's gaze never left hers. Because you once told me it was the loneliest place you had ever lived. Seraphina stared at him speechlessly. Theodore continued softly. I kept thinking about that after you left. Snow drifted endlessly beyond the windows behind them now. You said every room there felt beautiful but emotionally cold. His voice lowered. And I realized that described our marriage for too long. Seraphina felt tears threaten unexpectedly again. Theodore noticed immediately. Hey! His hand lifted instinctively before stopping halfway, still asking permission without words now. Seraphina looked at his hand briefly, then slowly stepped closer instead. Theodore's breath caught softly when she rested her forehead lightly against his chest beneath the warm library light. Such a small movement. Still, it nearly shattered him emotionally. Theodore wrapped his arms around her carefully, gently, like holding something precious enough to deserve reverence instead of certainty. Seraphina closed her eyes while listening to his heartbeat beneath layers of wool and winter air. For the first time in years, it did not feel like standing beside someone emotionally unreachable. Theodore rested his cheek softly against her hair. "I know I cannot erase what happened," he whispered. Seraphina's voice came muffled against his chest. "No," Theodore tightened his arms around her slightly, "but I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never question whether you are loved again." Tears slipped silently down her face then. Not from heartbreak this time. Relief. The terrifying relief of finally being seen completely after years spent feeling invisible beside the person who mattered most. Theodore felt her shaking slightly and pulled back just enough to look at her. Snowlight and firelight softened her face while tears shimmered against pale skin. "Beautiful. Always beautiful." Theodore touched beneath one eye carefully with his thumb. "What are you thinking?" Seraphina laughed softly through the tears. "That I hate how much I still love you." Theodore's expression broke into something unbearably tender then. "Good," he whispered, "because I am fairly certain losing you would have ruined me permanently." Seraphina looked up at him for a long moment while snow continued falling outside the windows and firelight wrapped quietly around the room. Then finally, slowly, she reached for him first. Theodore kissed her like a man apologizing and worshipping at the same time. No urgency, no possession, just warmth and grief and love rebuilt honestly from the ruins of everything they nearly destroyed. When they finally pulled apart, Theodore rested his forehead gently against hers while both of them breathed the same quiet winter air. "Come home with me," he whispered softly. Seraphina looked into his eyes, searching for hesitation, for distance, for another shadow standing invisibly between them. She found none. Only him. Finally, only him. Outside, snow continued covering Boston in white silence while inside the warm library